Chapter 1647. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1647. Understanding himself. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel woke up with Aina on his chest. After finishing his training, he didn't hurry to do things with the tentacle womb or other faction-building things because after a while, he suddenly felt the need to just spend time with Aina. When his spear force perfected its fusion with the final stage of his grandfather's path of the spear, Lionel's mind entered an odd state of relaxation where he suddenly understood that understanding himself was even more important than understanding individual forces. Anastasia's words, when taken to the logical extreme, precisely meant these things. Ultimately, just like with his spear force, the life of his forces didn't come from them, but rather himself. While they all had their own preferences and leanings, they were ultimately in his control. Running was always designed to be faster than running. By the same token, throwing was always designed to move things from your hand into a further distance. The same assignments could be made for walking, swimming, talking. Any one of these activities were things everyone and almost everything did naturally. They all also had the same exact purposes, regardless of who was executing them. However, did any two individuals do them the exact same way? Lionel had come to understand that he should treat force in this way as well. When he used force, he actively did something that was the equivalent of running or walking or swimming or even talking. However, he had always treated it as an external thing, not putting enough time and attention into them, much the same way that anyone could run, walk, swim or talk, but not everyone could do these things as effectively as another. And the route to reaching prominence in these facets was to first understand oneself. When it came to walking, you learned through trial and error as a child. When it came to running, you did the same thing. For swimming, it was the same once again, and it was even the same for talking. All of these things were forgotten by most as they happened so early on in life, but Lionel could remember those memories clearly. He could remember every failed attempt and reattempt. He could remember how he had to learn to shift his balance to adjust to his own body, not the other way around. Likewise, if he wanted to understand these forces, he would have to learn about himself as he learned about these forces. When he came to that conclusion, Lionel chose to relax. He awoke Aina from her meditation and brought her to leisurely stroll around the segmented cube. Aina was confused at first and didn't quite understand what the point of this was, but she realized it was rare for her to spend this kind of leisurely time with Lionel, at least not without someone or something wanting them to die. As time passed, she completely forgot that she didn't understand what was going on and why Lionel did this and simply smiled, enjoying her time with him. The relationship between Lionel and Aina had always been one of fiery passion and emotion. They danced between life and death, and even when they weren't, they were completely immersed in their training. There was nothing to see in the segmented cube aside from the beautiful ambience of nature, and yet it was so novel to them to casually view such sights that it was endlessly fascinating. The two talked endlessly, saying and talking about anything for days that quickly turned into over a week. And when they ran out of things to talk about, they simply felt silent. They didn't feel the need to fill the quiet air, the soft sounds of their breathing was enough. This was the closest moment to normal the two had received since the metamorphosis descended. It was hard to fathom, but since that last day of high school, the two of them had never had even a single moment of rest. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin// net. It was always battle after battle, war after war, death threat after death threat. Very soon they would likely have to return to such a life, but at least for now they felt at peace. Lionel reached down from Aina's waist and pinched her ass, causing her to stir awake. She slapped Lionel's hand away and adjusted herself on his chest before falling asleep again. Lionel laughed to himself. Alright, one more day wasn't too bad. Although the two of them hadn't crossed that final step yet, he had definitely made this little vixen pay for her earlier arrogance. Lionel wasn't very disappointed about this fact. Every time he and Aina seemed about to cross that line, it was always due to a state of fiery passion. The first time it was because Aina didn't want to lose Lionel, the second time the two of them were made at one another's approach to dealing with danger, and the third and most recent time, Aina had had a large amount of Lionel's blood in her system. After these days of calm and leisure, while that passion wasn't as fiery, it burned a lot more like an eternal fire, one that would last a lifetime. When that flame did finally boil over, he was sure that it would be worth the wait. After one more day, as promised, Lionel and Aina finally left the segmented cube, crossing over the void battlefield as they made their way toward the void palace. With the speed of the segmented cube, they crossed over large distances without much issue, shuttling through vast amounts of anarchic force as though it wasn't there at all. Half a month later, they made it to large gates once again, facing a vast mountain range that was several planets' widths wide. However, the state of the Void Palace wasn't like what Lionel remembered at all. Matched with its imposingness, a bloody scent hung in the air. In fact, what once were majestic gates that no one had to care about guarding because the prestige of the Void Palace was impregnable now had permanently stationed troops. As a result, the arrival of Lionel and Aina didn't go unnoticed. Chapter 1648. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1648. Shocking news: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stepped out from the segmented cube holding Aina's hand. He allowed it to shrink, becoming a finger band once again as he stared forward. At that time, a large number of auras pressed down, causing him to frown. This place actually couldn't truly be considered the Void Palace. In reality, it was one of the cities that formed the last line of defense on the Void battlefield. Lionel and Aina had been to this city before. It was the very same city they had come to after leaving the Rapak's nest. Right this moment, it was even larger and more imposing than before, even having troops stationed on the outside and along the walls. Lionel couldn't imagine why you would need a vanguard stationed outside of the city when the defenses were so great to begin with. But since he knew so little about the situation after being gone for so long, he didn't question it too much. Instead, he waited for the small squadron that was approaching to finish their approach. However, by this point, Lionel had already recognized the individual leading this small squad. He was Rowan Cancer, the very same young man who had tried to take advantage of Lionel's injury after he led them all out of the Rapak's nest in order to target Aina for her token. Back then, Aina had ended up killing a large number of Rowan's followers, but Rowan himself had managed to escape. It had been a long time since then, just over a year to Lionel and likely much longer than that to Rowan. Now, the rookie from back then who had entered along with Lionel was already strong enough to lead a squad here. So in all likelihood, Rowan neared the top tiers of galaxy-ranked disciples already, or might even be a sector-ranked disciple by now. It would mostly depend on what sort of talent he was. Rowan, of course, recognized Lionel and Aina as well, although his gaze was just as placid and emotionless as usual. However, that didn't change the fact he had some waves rising and falling in his heart. Lionel and Aina had just come back and clearly didn't understand the usual protocols. And, just about a month ago, the spatial phenomena that had had the human domain in its grips also came to an end. These two things were highly unlikely to be a coincidence. Although there were others who came very recently as well, given the odds, Lionel was definitely the top three most likely to have been the reason they could return. Of course, this was only to the general public. To the elders paying attention to these matters, they had already confirmed it with 100% accuracy. While Rowan was considered to be the most likely to inherit the Cancer family in the future, he didn't have that sort of cash just yet, and as such he could only make his own guesses. But the fact that this guess of his was so accurate already spoke volumes. The source of this content is n0v//elbin/net. Please display your disciple badges. Despite recognizing Lionel and Aina, Rowan still asked this. In fact, he also pretended as though the trio of them had no prior history and that he hadn't tried to kill Lionel not just once but twice. Lionel calmly looked toward Rowan and flipped his palm over to reveal his badge. However, to his surprise, rather than just casually looking over it, both his and Aina's badges underwent several layers of inspection before they were finally allowed to take them back. Although his first reaction was to believe that Rowan was purposely making things difficult for him, Lionel didn't act on this, mostly because it made little sense. Delaying them by an extra few minutes for the sake of something so petty made little sense. In addition, these guards seemed to have specially created devices purely for the sake of inspecting his badge, something that made little sense unless there was a good reason. You two can enter the city now. Lionel put his badge away and scanned the squad again. Is there a case of people impersonating Void Palace disciples? Lionel asked. Rowan's eyes flashed before he nodded slowly. Yes. The cloud race has encroached onto our territory in recent decades and has become more brazen. In addition, areas we used to hold firm control over have weakened drastically. Now that Earth has entered the 7th dimension faster than was expected, our enemies have re-upped their efforts and are pressing us. It's also the case that during the spatial phenomena that just ended, the region was incredibly unstable, making it difficult for us to safely maintain a defensive line, but simultaneously very easy for enemies to cross large distances into our territory via teleportation. So this is the situation now. Lionel's brows jumped in surprise, but the squadron which followed Rowan was equally as shocked. Rowan was a man of very few words and they had never heard him speak so much all at one time like this. But he had done so for this individual? Who was this exactly? The number of people that could recognize Lionel by his face were simply too few in number. He had only spent a short time in the Void Palace and hadn't interacted with enough people to truly build fame. While the event of him clearing dozens of floors in his first attempt at the Void Tower was circulated, that was also more than 2 decades ago, and the amount of things that happened since then were too many. Seeing this now, though, Rowan's squadron seemed to understand that Lionel must have been a prominent figure before the cataclysm. Lionel, though, was shocked by something else entirely. It seemed that in his absence, Earth had become a name even the geniuses of the Void Palace was very familiar with. Not only that, but in just a short 20 or so years, it had actually become a seventh-dimensional world already, and a vicious storm was brewing around this matter. Chapter 1649. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1649. Asks if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel calmed himself and nodded. Is there anywhere I'm supposed to go after this? Lionel asked. Yes. All those who have just returned from the zone must report to the Void Senate. As for the details, they'll inform you about them. Lionel nodded and took Aina's hand again as they entered the city to use a teleportation platform to the core of the Void Palace. As for his thoughts, they were much less calm than the rhythmic cadence of his heart. The Cloud Race. He knew about them as well. They were a race of people adept at mimicry. They could freely change their forms and embody whatever their eyes could see. When Lionel first learned about this race from the Void Library, he was quite confused. After all, Y-Star Order had told him that humans were the weakest of the races because they couldn't focus their attention down one path. Then how, exactly, was the Cloud Race so powerful? Shouldn't they be even weaker than humans following this logic? Well, the truth was, the Cloud Race was near the bottom of the barrel along with humans and the Dwarven race, but they were still considered to be stronger than the both. This was because the mimicry of the Cloud Race was all focused on one thing: countering. The Cloud Race were experts in defense and using your weaknesses against you. This style of battle made them exceptionally powerful, and while they couldn't be considered to be at the pinnacle of the most powerful races, they were still well known to be superior to the humans. Ironically, though, it was precisely because of this that the humans fared so well against the Cloud Race. Because humans weren't as homogeneous as the other races, countering them took time and effort, and true human geniuses might be able to defeat Cloud Race geniuses before said genius could get a grasp on their abilities. Still, the fact that the Void Palace had suddenly become so cautious against the Cloud Race must mean that by the time Lionel was gone, they must have made great headway into grasping the secrets of the human domain. If the Cloud Race wanted to wage war against the humans, they didn't need to understand all of them, they just needed to understand the weaknesses of the greatest powerful among them. The Morales family, the Seward family, the Constellation Alliances, Shield Cross Stars, the Crafting Guilds, the Constellation families, so long as these few powers were grasped, who cared about the weaker humans? They weren't good enough to match up again even normal Cloud Race members to begin with. The less complex the talent, the easier it was to counter on a whim. It wasn't long before Lionel stood at the base of a mountain, looking up. He knew that the Void Senate was up there, but this was actually the first time he had been to his place. At the bottom, there were people present to escort them up, and they were soon brought to an office. When Lionel and Aina entered, they found a black-haired man sitting across from them behind a desk. He didn't look up even after the door closed, but this aura did seem to grow heavier. Just from a glance, Lionel could see that this man was missing an arm, one of his robe sleeves behind decidedly looser than the other. By the time an entire minute passed, Lionel's eyes had narrowed into slits. While Rowan wouldn't know that he was the reason everyone could return, how could someone who could sit at the top of the Void Senate not understand? And even if they assumed that it was Aina and not him, wasn't Aina right by his side anyway? And yet, this man hadn't said a single word since they entered. Looking back at the man's missing arm, Lionel's furrowed brows loosened and his expression became calm. There was a better than 70% likelihood that this was the man his father took the arm of, and likely also the catalyst for what put the sword and spear factions at each other's throat. Lionel didn't know what was going on with that situation now, or if the two factions had set aside their differences to face a greater threat, but judging by Rosen's reaction, that much was unlikely. Rosen seemed to sense that Lionel's demeanor had entirely relaxed, and he suddenly looked up, his gaze piercing. It truly felt as though a pair of swords were hidden within the depths of his gaze. An invisible aura shot forward, as sharp as a blade, but when it entered an unknown radius of Lionel, it dissipated into the wind, leaving Rosen with narrowed eyes. Lionel didn't even seem to have moved a single inch or down anything. But in reality neither did he. "The procedure is simple," Rosen said emotionlessly. "Here are the documents." Write down everything you've experienced in the zone, catalog all of the events by day for all exactly 63 days that were inside. Do not miss a single day. Also, document all treasures that you've received from the zone. The Void Palace will not take any of them, but will inspect them, categorize them, and then return them to you in a timely fashion. This is only for the benefit of knowledge and the progress of humanity into the future. We will not steal from our students. If you've understood, take these documents and leave. Lionel's gaze flashed. As expected, it was highly unlikely that he would be the only one to benefit from the zone. Still, there was one question that left him baffled until this point. He had forgotten about it because he had met Aina and she seemed to be just fine. But why was it that his cousin and the others couldn't use force or their ability indexes while he could? Could it be that there were others who were able to use their force like he and Aina, and as such had managed to gain treasures of their own? Lionel reached a hand forward and took the documents for both himself and Aina, ready to leave. There's also one more matter, Rosen said lightly as Lionel was about to depart. For you, especially, the Void Palace would like to thoroughly understand the method you used to break the cardinal rule of zones. Please don't miss out on any details. Lionel remained silent and didn't respond, but his thoughts were already racing. How should he handle this matter exactly? There was absolutely nothing wrong with either Rosen's words or the Void Palace's asks of him. But his instincts were pulling him in a different sort of direction. Chapter 1650. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1650. Second method. Same problem if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel sat in a hall of the Void Senate in silence. Aina sat by his side looking at the documents as well. Though when she sensed Lionel's odd mood, she looked over as well. Lionel's gaze was a bit unfocused, but his pupils continued to flicker as though he was calculating something. The decision wasn't a simple one. Logically, there shouldn't be a problem with helping the Void Palace, but there were too many potential issues with doing so, especially since there were still signs of traitors in their midst. The only people he could trust aside from himself were Aina and his parents. The ask of the Void Palace was very reasonable. Wanting to document the treasures of that zone made perfect sense, and they would also return it. In addition, wanting to know how Lionel had escaped also made sense. Who knew how useful such information could be in the future? If they could patent an ability to escape zones, there would be many zones that they didn't dare to easily enter previously that they could finally start exploring with full effort. For example, now that Earth had entered the 7th dimension for the first time, the human domain had to contend with 8th dimensional zones. But the number of characters who wielded such a level of power were far too few, and they were so important to the backbone of the human domain that they couldn't possibly enter to risk their lives so easily. This resulted in a situation where there were many zones with potentially excellent resources inside that no one dared to make use of. But if these zones were allowed to linger for too long, then the territory of Earth would end up swallowed and destroyed. If that happened, what was the worth of everything else? Earth had suddenly become integral to the prosperity of the dimensional verse, and it was very likely that everyone had been waiting precisely for Lionel to return so that they could understand how he did it. Lionel obviously understood all of this, but what would happen when he revealed that this was only possible because of the unique characteristics of the segmented cube? Unless someone could create a treasure of equivalent stature, it would be a fool's dream to attempt an escape from a zone. In order to force the bubbles of the human domain and a zone to connect, and thus expel all outsiders from within the latter, it required the travel of a spatial item between the two. Said spatial item had to have enough structural integrity to survive the journey as well, or else it would all be useless. Essentially, you needed a treasure on a level close to the 9th dimension, or at least at the very cutting edge of the 8th. In this regard, the segmented cube was practically one of a kind. In the past, Lionel had simply assumed that every family in the human domain would have a treasure of this caliber. But the more he learned, the more he came to understand just how ridiculous such a thought was. In fact, he was certain that the existence of the segmented cube had a grand backstory Anastasia would probably refuse to tell him about. And in such a case where there only existed one solution, just what would happen? He had just learned that the cloud race was making efforts to infiltrate the human domain and impersonate their kind. And he had already deduced that there were likely traitors at the highest echelon of the Void Palace, or else certain things just could not have happened that way. If these individuals suddenly learned that there was only one item in the human domain capable of breaking the rules of the zone, and said item was in the hands of a Morales family member, what kind of situation would that put the Morales family in? However, if Lionel lied about how he had done it, the moment they attempted to use his method and realized that it didn't work, not only would the human domain lose whoever had entered the zone, he would also gain the ire of the human domain and things would end up terribly regardless. If I had known Earth was already in the 7th dimension, I wouldn't have returned so easily. Lionel closed his eyes and sighed. Lionel suddenly felt a soft hand slip into his and he smiled lightly without opening his eyes. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin/net. He had already known that there would be trouble like this when they returned, the only surprise was that it had actually come so quickly. But since he had already chosen Aina over the world, was there even a need to regret it? Lionel's heart shuddered and his thoughts flashed. When his eyes snapped open, they had a blazing light within them, but they quickly dimmed. Even if I've thought of another method to escape zones, it still doesn't change the facts of the matter. Lionel flipped a palm over and whispered, "Valiant Seal." A miniature trio of revolving pillars forms. This was another one of Lionel's self-created techniques. He had formed it using the Valiant Pillars of Valiant Heart Mountain and Camelot's magic system as a foundation. That treasure was designed to take control of zones. Theoretically, Lionel believed that if the power to control zones was harnessed and then forced into vessels like the segmented cube, then it should be possible to use them like the segmented cube's world to escape zones. If Lionel refined this method over a few weeks, he could easily hand this method over to the Void Palace and solve the potential issue of having the Morales family become everyone's target. But if he did so, this method would fall into the hands of the human domain's enemies as well. The problem is still the same. Lionel thought to himself, squeezing Aina's hand lightly. To think that he would be clever enough to think of such things, only to be faced with the dilemma of whether to share them or not. As Lionel was lost in thought, the clicking of heels echoed through the Void Senate's halls. When he looked up, he found a woman with vibrant green hair walking. He didn't think too much of it until, that is, the woman's eyes emitted a coldness upon meeting his gaze. Chapter 1651. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 1651. Triana, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel met her gaze, his expression calm. Judging by this person's expression, she was definitely one of the Virer family. But considering the fact she was casually strolling through the Void Palace Senate, the number of people she could be was drastically lowered. The odds that this person was precisely the Triana Virer that had been harassing Lionel and Aina with her Green Thread faction. This woman sure knows how to hold a grudge. It's only been a year for me, but statistically speaking, it's been at least 10 years for her depending on when she was expelled from the zone. The fact that she still has the mind to look at me so coldly is asinine. Lionel hadn't forgotten the things this woman had done. He hadn't even gone to find her yet, but she seemed to have stumbled into him first. There were simply certain things that Lionel found to be unacceptable. He had already chosen Aina over the world once. Did this woman believe that she would get off scot-free after ordering her men to not only attack his Aina, but to even do something as demeaning as stripping her down and hanging her up for everyone to see? Despite the calmness in Lionel's eyes, there was a hidden oppressive aura within that hung in the air. He didn't care how long he had been gone for. Triana could count herself lucky that this was the Void Senate and not just any place where Lionel could act as he pleased. He looked away, ignoring her. He crushed the Valiant Seal. He formed in his palm and flipped his hand over. With a rush, a surge of dream force came out of his hand and caused the documents to light up. The so-called documents were just a few pendants. One was used to record their experiences and the other was used to note down their treasures. Both would be handed in along with the treasures that they received from the zone. Others would probably take a few hours, maybe even longer, to finish. But Lionel was someone who had managed to read the entire history of law of the Void Palace in just a few seconds. Now that he had returned even stronger, noting down what occurred in just a 2-month period, even if it was incredibly detailed, took almost no effort whatsoever. In fact, while he finished, he also noted to Aina what she should disclose and what she shouldn't. His decision had been made. Once he was finished, he stood, having taken no more than a few seconds total to finish everything. The moment he stood, he found Triana just a meter from him, her gaze sparking. Lionel had had many thoughts on how this interaction would go, but what he didn't expect was what actually happened. Without a word or even an attempt to communicate, Triana's palm suddenly shot forward. What was shocking, though, was the fact that this palm wasn't aimed for Lionel, but rather Aina, who still had her mind within the pendants, marking down everything Lionel had asked of her. The truth was that making up stories that could fool the Void Palace elders was incredibly difficult. They would be able to pick out the deficiencies in your claims far too quickly. Their minds at that level worked no slower than Lionel's own a few paces back. So, when Lionel had told Aina what to write, he went into great detail. After all, he was very familiar with what she had experienced and could adjust it as such. Due to this, Aina hadn't even noticed Triana's appearance at all because she couldn't split her mind to the same degree Lionel could. Right then, Lionel's calm expression became frighteningly cold. With a single step, he blocked the path to Aina and struck out, the speed of his fist being incredibly swift. Bang! Palm and fist met, sharp winds whistling into the surroundings. Lionel's body glowed with a bronze aura, dispersing Triana's strength and adding an extra boost to his own. Triana took 3 heavy steps backward, her gaze flickering with surprise. Even though physical prowess wasn't her strongest suit, she was still a Tier 6 expert of the 6th dimension. She shouldn't need to use her strongest abilities to deal with the likes of Lionel, especially since she had attacked first. However, what Triana didn't consider was the fact that Lionel could be just as unruly and unreasonable as her. Someone else might ask her why she had attacked or give her time to recover, but Lionel simply didn't care. He took another strong step forward, the rhythm of his movements causing the ground to vibrate. Bang! A cone of wind followed his punch, colliding with Triana's face without a care for her beauty. The source of this content is N0V//Elbin/. Net she flew backward and crashed into the wall of the Void Senate Hall, the commotion spreading far and wide. Lionel walked forward as Triana's vision spun. He picked her up by her neck and only then did he speak for the first time. "What did you mean by doing this?" His voice was doused in a chilly wind, his hand clawing around her neck with a menacing grip. "Halt!" At that moment, a surge of aura rushed toward the location, many of whom were completely surprised. No one dared to cause a commotion in the Void Senate, its dignity simply couldn't be encroached upon. And yet today it had actually happened. When they converged, they were shocked to find that the person dangling with her feet in the air was actually Triana. Triana was almost too famous in the Void Palace. Despite being from a relatively average family when the wider Void Palace was taken into account, she managed to form a monopoly over the medicinal factions that only increased after the cataclysm. Just a year ago, she finally managed to reach the heights many could only dream of, and she entered a party of the Senate with thoughts of returning to her faction in the future and raising it to the status of a party as well. But who would have known that this famous individual would be humiliated like this in the Void Senate? It was then that someone from Triana's party arrived, and this person had a bow strapped to their backs. Chapter 1652? Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:26 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1652. LOL concealed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't look at anyone else, an ill intent blazing in his eyes as he looked toward Triana. By this point, Triana had recovered, only to realize that her neck was already under the control of a junior. First she felt shocked, then humiliated, before a towering fury erupted forth from her in a torrent. She didn't seem to care that Lionel had control of her neck. As though she would rather die than not dare to struggle, her force rose like a tempest, a violent pressure blasting against Lionel's body. Clang, clang, clang. The sounds of Triana's force rebounding against Lionel's body sounded no different from metal clashing with metal, and he was even forced to slide back a measure. At the same time, the grip he had had on Triana's throat was forced open, causing his eyes to narrow. Lionel had never seen anyone expelling force from their neck like that. Could it be a method that had already existed in the human domain? Or was it something that she had picked up from the zone? Triana released a shrill shriek, her rage forming several green vines of force that lashed out toward Lionel like a whip. By the time they crossed the small distance between the two, they had gone from barely formed to a shimmering emerald. It looked as though flexible gems were lashing out toward him, each of them carrying a lethal intent. Lionel's gaze was frighteningly cold. He didn't have any intention to kill. If he had, how could Triana have escaped from his grip so quickly? If you gained control of an opponent's neck in real combat, the battle was over. But Triana had clearly taken advantage of his state of mind to escape. It only took Lionel an instant to see through this, his intent only growing colder. Just when it seemed that Triana's vines would shred him to pieces, his absolute spear domain suddenly manifested, a golden vortex of sharp blades rotating around him and ripping Triana's attack to shreds. Lionel pressed 2 fingers together and pierced them forward. In that instant, it felt like everything in the world had come to a chilling pause. The silence was deafening. From a large commotion that had caught the attention of most in the building, it felt like they had suddenly entered the vacuum of space. There were no sounds of sharpening blades, no trembling walls and floors, not even the whistling wind of Lionel slicing the air in two could be heard. Triana's eyes only had time to widen before her chest was pierced through. There wasn't a single drop of blood for several moments as she fell backward, her eyes wide. It was only after she fell to the floor that her body jolted and a pool of blood quickly formed, drenching her green dress in a tide of crimson. "You!" From their shocked state, the first individual rose up roaring. This man was none other than the very man who had come from Triana's party, a man with a bow strapped to his back. It wasn't at all convenient to use a bow in an enclosed space like this, but the young man was so confident in his abilities and control that he didn't even hesitate to pull out his own. All he could see was red, believing that Lionel had just killed Triana. From the roar to the release of the bowstring, there wasn't even a span of half a second. There was no doubt that the drawing skills of the young man were exceptional, and it only became more clear after his sixth-dimensional bow force shot a streaking light through the void-scented hallway aimed right for Lionel's head. Lionel frowned, his cold gaze shifting in the direction of the young man. He had already locked eyes on him before his bow even left his back and watched the entire process of loading and firing. The young man might have thought that his speed was fast, but could it be faster than Lionel's senses? The arrow appeared between Lionel's brows in an instant. It almost looked as though it had teleported there from the bow it had just been released from, prepared to take Lionel's life. However, Lionel didn't even move. Clang. The arrow rebounded upward, rapidly spinning through the air as its bow force tried to continue forward without it. But the moment the bow force tried to harm Lionel, it was as though it had vanished into the wind. With the very same two fingers he had used to pierce toward Triana, Lionel drew an arc through the air, snatching the spinning arrow out of its motion with even quicker movements. Then, in one swift motion, his back flexed and he took a small step forward. Bang! The arrow rocketed out from his throw like a ball out of a cannon, moving with so much speed that it didn't even arc through the air. Rather, it drew a line through the hallways, appearing before the young man in an instant. The arrow shot through the raised bow which was prepared to shoot a second arrow, snapped the bow string in two, before burying itself into the chest of the young man. The party member coughed out a mouthful of blood in astonishment, still not quite believing what he had just seen. Had his arrow really been so casually dealt with? How was that even possible? Right that moment, the door to Rosen's office opened and he stepped out with a stern expression, his armless sleeve whipping in the wind beneath his aura. Feeling the presence of a seventh-dimensional expert, no one dared to move even a single inch as Rosen scanned the surroundings. To think that someone would actually dare to make such commotion right outside of his office, weren't these people a bit too brazen? When Rosen saw not just one but two students with bloody wounds through their chests, his expression became even colder. His gaze snapped toward Lionel, an ill-concealed distaste flashing in his eyes. Chapter 1653, published at 7th of March 2023, 3:26 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1653. Neither if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again, this is the Void Senate. The words were unhurried and didn't seem to have any extra emphasis, but the moment that they were spoken, it was as though a heavy mountain had fallen onto the shoulders of the spectators. Among them, there was no doubt that Lionel experienced the greatest pressure there was. You two 1 year in the Void Mines. As for you 10. The two Rosen mentioned were without a doubt Triana and the youth with an arrow in his chest. That meant that the last was most definitely Lionel. Lionel's gaze flickered. He knew the rule book of the Void Palace front to back, so he was also well aware that this punishment was actually in line with proper practices. Rosen hadn't taken a single step out of line. Still, wanting him to spend 10 years mining for a conflict started by someone else was impossible. If Rosen thought Lionel would really do that, he had another thing coming. Sensing Lionel's gaze, Rosen met it, seemingly wanting to see if he would dare to refute. In fact, his placid gaze almost seemed to beg for it. In the past, he had been much more brazen, even arrogantly kicking out the stalwart polearm party from their position as joint majority. However, ever since that even with Lionel's father, he had hidden much of his sharpness, stoking a flame deep within his heart to push onward. In these 20 years, 14 of which he had been back for, he had progressed by leaps and beyond, already surpassing his former rival Uramus of the stalwart polearm party by a large margin. Still, even with this being the case, he still hadn't revealed that hidden sharpness. Uramus was nothing but a defeated opponent, he didn't deserve his effort. The only man that was in his eyes now was Velasco Morales. Every day he persevered through training most couldn't imagine just for the faintest chance that he could return the favor for this lost arm of his. In truth, he didn't even put Lionel in his eyes, and why would he? There was a far deeper pride ingrained within him. It had to be remembered that Rosen didn't send the youths to the Rapak's nest to target Lionel in the first place. His only intention was to help Amory get a leg up for his sword domain tribulation. As for the youths that had targeted Lionel, they were exactly that, youths. He simply didn't care to. But if Lionel was going to blatantly spit in the face of the rules of the Void Palace and get in his way, thinking himself to be as great an obstacle as his father, Rosen wouldn't mind showing him the disparity between the two of them. And yet, Lionel only smiled lightly. With a flip of his palm, he brought out his two pendants and directly shattered them. Rosen's pupils constricted. Lionel's movements weren't exactly fast, but it was still impossible for him to react. At the same time, although the pendants didn't look special, they were still incredibly sturdy materials. Breaking them at Lionel's level shouldn't have been such a casual action. In fact, it should have taken quite a bit of strain. What do you mean by this? Rosen asked just as unhurriedly. Lionel blinked, almost as though he was confused by the question. Mean by what? Rosen's gaze narrowed. This Lionel, when it came to pissing people off, there was no doubt that he was no less proficient than that father of his. It was almost a crime that such a charismatic smile could be coming from such a bastard. It seems that you want to test my patience. Lionel thought for a moment before nodding. 10 years is indeed a long time. I guess that even for someone as old as you, it can be considered a while as well. Rosen felt his heart twitch. It had been a long time since he had felt something like this. After losing his arm, nothing seemed capable of fazing him, and the state of his heart was as clear and still as water. But he suddenly felt the need to punch a hole through Lionel's face. Lionel's expression didn't show much of a change, but he was coldly smiling on the inside. What a ridiculous rule. Just because he had injured someone who attacked first, he had to waste 10 years of his life while they only had to exchange a year? Even if that was indeed what the rule book states, he didn't care. These people liked to claim that he only had this level of attainment in the Void Palace because his mother had handed it to him, right? They had even stripped him of his rightfully earned galaxy rank because they couldn't fathom how far he had climbed up the Void Tower. And now they wanted him to mine or for them for 10 years? Sure, that was fine. In that case, Lionel wanted to see if they'd be willing to wait 10 years for his method of returning from a failed zone too. Since they wanted to play a patience game they could play together. In fact, he would show people what true unfairness looked like. Did he break the rules? Yes, he did. What were you going to do about it? The reality of this was that Lionel could choose to just leave the Void Palace as well. After all, the Void Palace wouldn't detain people against their will, at least not for something so inconsequential. It was more accurate to look at it like Lionel exchanging 10 years for a chance to remain in the Void Palace after his punishment years were through. But if they really chose to follow through with such a punishment, Lionel would just directly leave. And if he was no longer a disciple of a Void Palace, then that would also mean that they didn't have a right to ask him about his treasures, nor did they have a right to ask him for a method of escaping failed zones. When that crossroads was reached, the Void Palace would have quite a decision to make. Deal with Lionel and get the information they wanted, and face his old man's revenge on the back end. Or simply let Lionel go. Neither of these things were what they wanted to do. Chapter 1654. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1654. Proven right. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel knew that he would likely be the subject of a plot very soon. In fact, he didn't know if this was a scheme or not, although he felt that the potential that it was just about 10% likely less. Rosen carried too important a position in the Seward family, and though the Morales and Sewards were always at each other's throats, Lionel didn't believe that they were incompetent enough to have a traitor at such a high ranking, nor did he believe that the Seward family itself was a traitor to the human domain. In all likelihood, this was really just a coincidence. But that didn't mean that the scheme wasn't coming. In order to deal with that inevitable end, Lionel had to position himself properly while also squeezing out as many benefits as he could from the Void Palace in the meantime. Even though this would piss a lot of people off, and there might even be some people on the side of humanity who thought his actions to be too selfish and abhorrent, all he cared about was the end result. For now, they would treat him as public enemy number one, but when the time came that he wiped the Three-Finger Cult from existence, they would come to understand the actions he would take this time around. Rosen slowly nodded to Lionel's words as though he was confirming what he was hearing for himself, and ensuring that this was indeed reality. This was likely the first time in the history of the Void Palace that a student of the Sixth Dimension dared to act in this way. Although Lionel hadn't said it in so many words, this was no doubt a threat. This singular young man suddenly held what was likely the fate of humanity by the balls, and he had such a sickening smile on his face. Anyone seeing such a scene would have a hard time telling just who was the hero and who was the villain. It felt like the moment Lionel had chosen Aina over humanity, he stopped caring about those details as they simply didn't matter to him. He had already resigned himself to the fact that many people would die due to his decisions, but he still felt that this was the only path forward. In his time in the dimensional verse, he had taken the life of almost 1,000 people. In fact, he knew the exact number 932. This was a number that accounted for the human domain and zones. If he accounted for the number of lives that he had taken via second-hand means, meaning through his commands or his schemes, the number was easily tenfold that. If he chose not to be hypocrite and accounted for the number of demons and beasts he had killed as well, the number was at least twofold of that. He had come a long way from the teenage boy who almost allowed his life to be taken by a young woman because he couldn't bear the sins on his shoulders any longer. A very long way. The clarity he felt now was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Those few days of quiet harmony he had spent with Aina had taught him a lot, and it made him understand a large measure more about himself, and namely, the weight he had accepted on his shoulders. That day in the Rapak's nest, he had allowed his father to take that burden away from him for a time. But now, it was about time he took that burden back. Standing there, facing a seventh-dimensional expert who wanted nothing more than to take his life, Lionel stood tall and proud, his gaze unwavering and his smile calm. Those watching such a scene suddenly felt like they were watching a standoff of two equals. No, it even faintly felt like Lionel was on a level all to his own. Even in the face of someone more than just a single large dimension ahead of him, he could still maintain such an air. Rosen finished nodding his head, giving Lionel a deep look. "I will relay your words properly." Lionel chuckled. Relay his words? What words had he spoken exactly? At that moment, Aina awoke from her focused state and looked around with a hint of confusion. Seeing the bleeding Triana to Lionel's back and the young man with an arrow in her chest, her lips couldn't help but twitch. She had been lost in her own world for all of a few minutes, and yet this trouble magnet had gone and done it again. "Don't look at me like that, this time it's your fault." Aina rolled her eyes but didn't bother to refute Lionel's words. After handing her pendants over to Rosen respectfully, Aina allowed Lionel to take her hand and they both strolled out from the Void Senate. Those watching couldn't help but feel waves rolling in their hearts. For some reason they felt that there would be a big upheaval in the Void Palace very soon. "I will let this matter go once. All future conflicts must occur outside of Void Senate grounds, including all branches. This is a rule that has been written in stone and cannot be violated. If there is a second time, I will triple the punishment." Rosen left these words behind as he turned and left, his gaze a frightening and chilly cold. Not long after Lionel, Aina and Rosen left, the members of Triana's party came rushing over. Some spectators remained in this area precisely to see this matter through, as Triana's party was not simple at all. In fact, it was among the so-called silent majority, a group of up-and-coming newly established parties that were beginning their attempt to become the replacement for the stalwart polearm party. In fact, even the stalwart polearm party themselves had been promoted once again and become part of this silent majority. Everyone had said that Lionel's generation was the most talented the human domain had ever seen, and time proved them right. The vast majority of the heads of this silent majority were precisely the very youths that Lionel had entered the Rapak's nest with. And, as though that wasn't enough, one of the executive positions of Triana's party was led by a young man who Lionel was very familiar with, a young man who had even threatened not just Lionel but the whole Morales family in the past. He was none other than the only other young man to master sixth-dimensional Bao Force in the fifth dimension alongside Lionel, a genius of the constellation Bao Alliance, Nazagtarius. Chapter 1655. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1655. Prestige of the Void Elders. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Rosen was a man of his word. After he left the Void Senate, he entered Void Peak to seek an audience. Even for the current Rosen, including all of his improvements, he couldn't casually come to this place without reason. And even in the case he did have a reason, he still had to be respectful and patient. These individuals, the Void Elders, represented the very pinnacle of the human race. Together, the power they held was enough to be the face of the humans, and it surpassed any individual family. If this wasn't the case, how could they dare to claim to raise the future generation of leaders? The Void Elders were formed of a group of men and women with no affiliations to the large families or organizations. They were existences who, over the course of history, could have built up their own families and powers, but instead chose to forsake this path and become the beacon of humanity instead. As a result of this, the Void Elders had no ties to the major families. There was an obvious reason why this was a good thing. After all, this would ensure that the Void Elders didn't have any special ties to the students and didn't try to steer the Void Palace toward any particular direction. In fact, they were incentivized to ensure that the Void Palace remained power, because only when the Void Palace was powerful would they have the backing they had forsaken after taking up their posts. The sacrifice of the Void Elders didn't end here. These characters weren't allowed to have relationships, and they also weren't allowed to have children. Their entire lives were dedicated to the Void Palace. Any new Void Elder was raised up directly from the Void Palace itself. They made their vows early, and they were monitored and nurtured to replace the previous batch as they grew old and passed on. Such individuals couldn't be affiliated with any power families or organizations before entering the palace, and they were also the only ones who would receive the personal nurturing of the Void Elders. In fact, they couldn't even join factions or parties in their youths, as this could be considered another form of forming relationships and potential biases in the future. Lionel himself had met one such person before. This individual was none other than Cornelius. Knowing all of this, it was no wonder why everyone was so respectful of the Void Elders. This respect was deeper than just their power, but it was also a function of their sacrifice. If these individuals wanted, they could have formed powerful families of their own, adding to the chaos of the human domain. Instead, they chose peace and unity, laying down their pride and becoming just one piece of a greater whole. The prestige of the Void Elders in the hearts of the masses was not small, and it was also due to this that Lionel's father wasn't very well liked as the only person who didn't give the Void Elders their due respect. But today, it seemed that another of the Morales family line would be smacking the faces of these exceptional characters as well. Before Rosen stood 3 elders. Without fail, all 3 of them looked to be exceptionally frail, as though they might use the last of their life force at any moment. And yet, Rosen didn't dare to be the slightest bit disrespectful. Such individuals, the fact they seemed so ordinary was precisely what made them so fearsome. Their level of control was on a level all to their own. 2 of these elders were older women, with one of them being a man. Of them, only one of the women didn't use a cane, and all of them wore black robes embroidered in gold. They gazed toward Rosen with murky eyes that carried a hint of anticipation. It was rare for these elders to be so curious and eager about something, and it was even rarer for 3 of them to appear for just a mere Rosen's request. Obviously, this was a special occasion to them. How could it not be? The spatial storm phenomena had just come to an end a few months ago, and they had already received a report that Lionel was back. They were all certain that Lionel was the one who allowed all of them to return, because his life signature was the absolute last to come back by a small fraction of a second, just after Aina's. This meant that he was the true core of everything that had happened. Only a select few individuals knew of this, but they had all been waiting for Lionel to come back a long while now, all for over a month to pass since then. They had been worried that something went wrong, but luckily everything was just fine. Now they could finally get the answers they were hoping for. Void Elder Vimark, Void Elder Galien, Void Elder Lisbeth. Rosen bowed respectfully. Much like Cornelius, even Void Elders were all called by their first names, their last names having been discarded. Vimark, the only male of them, waved a hand and smiled. No need for such formalities, just pass the pendants to us. We've been truly eager these last few days. It's rare for us older timers to have something to be excited about. About this. Rosen started slowly and explained the events from start to finish. He didn't embellish anything because he simply didn't have to. All that was necessary was to describe things exactly as they had occurred. As Rosen continued along with his story, the smile on Vimark's expression slowly faded. Although none of the 3 showed any fury or rage, their placid indifference placed a heavy weight on Rosen, who wasn't even the subject of their potential anger. Rosen summarized the events quickly. I did not dare to make a decision personally, so I came here to speak to esteemed Void Elders. The 3 Void Elders fell into silence, not answering immediately. Chapter 1656. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 54 seconds p.m. Chapter 1656. Aged hands. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Rosen lowered his head and waited patiently for a reply. He didn't dare to rush these figures who stood at the same and sometimes even far greater heights than the elders of his own family. This was especially so since elders of the Void Palace tended to live far longer than normal humans for reasons that were unknown to the wider population. This allowed them far more time to accumulate, and their strength couldn't be underestimated. Having heard Rosen's story, The Void Elders understood what had happened. They were even able to deduce some of what had likely started this. But, likewise, they were also able to guess at some of Lionel's thoughts due to him brazenly taking such actions. The conclusion was quite obvious to them, and they felt that Lionel was still a little too tender. It was clear that Lionel didn't truly want to hand over this method, and the matters with Triana and her party had just given him an excuse. It's a bit amusing, Galliena, the only one of them to not use a cane, spoke. It seems that he's learned a bit too much from his father. Compared to the other elders, although she looked just as old, she also seemed to have a perpetual deep frown tattooed onto her brows. The way she clasped her hand behind her back and stood as straight as a spear despite her age spoke volumes. She looked as though she could step onto a field right this moment and become a drill sergeant. The other Void Elders didn't respond to this immediately. It seemed that they were still thinking of ways to deal with this situation properly. They were the Void Palace, not some hell house. They couldn't just capture students and torture information out of them. What would that make them look like? This didn't even consider the fact of if they dared to. The Void Palace could be considered to be a tier above all other human powers, but it would still be foolish of them to target a member of a prominent family, especially when it was a family of madmen like the Morales. Montez had been banished from the Void Palace long ago, but didn't he still come and go as he pleased? And that was doubly so for Velasco, who had even taken the arm of the young man right before them right now. His edge needs to be dulled, Void Elder Lisbeth spoke lightly. Let things take their course then, Vimark finished. The three spoke as though they could read each other's thoughts. There was a smooth flowing progression from one to the next, and their words only became more enigmatic as they passed along, as though they were playing some kind of higher dimensional game of telephone. You can go back, child of the Seared family. No need to do anything special, Vimark said. Rosen's gaze flashed, but by the time he looked up, the three elders had already vanished, leaving a shiver in his heart. Rosen was too intelligent to not understand where this was going. Learned too much from his father, edge needs to be dulled, let things take their course? Lionel was the very last to return, while most had returned years ago. Although there were a few that had returned within the last year, it could be said that the bulk of individuals had returned over a decade ago. This made sense. After all, the further away one was from Lionel when the phenomena began, the quicker they were to return. Lionel hadn't met anyone else that was of the Void Palace during the demon hunting event, so the likelihood that anyone was close enough to him to only return recently was very small. Whether it was Lionel or Aina, both of them had come from the most talented generation. In the future, there was no doubt that they'd eventually catch up to those lofty figures who had already surpassed their seniors. However, they would still need the same amount of time that these lofty figures had needed as well. But Lionel was unlucky. He had done a great service to the Void Palace by helping everyone to return and allowing the human domain to have a chance at survival. But in doing so, he had caused him to lag behind by as much as 2 decades in comparison to his peers. Among these peers, there were a great number who were still dissatisfied with the result of the Rapax Nest trials and how Lionel had stopped them all from benefiting. There were the Archer factions who were furious about the loss of their White Lion bow. There were the Sword factions who were infuriated by the actions of his father back then. And there were even Lionel's own cousins who wanted nothing more than for him to be suppressed, as the previously postponed Morales Air Wars were quickly approaching. They as Void Elders had no need to stoop to the point of dealing with a child. Very soon, he would find himself stifled to the point that he may very well beg to enter the mines and obediently dig for a decade. By that point, the information they wanted would be neatly arranged for them on a silver platter. When Rosen came to understand their intentions, his heart couldn't help but tremble. The understanding toward even the present situation of the Void Palace that the Void Elders had was beyond expectations. Even sitting here on their thrones, the entirety of the human domain was still in the palm of their aged hands. Rosen exhaled a breath, but it came out uneven and shuddering. He couldn't help but look inwardly and ask himself how many things he had done in the dark, that were also so clear to them. He rose to his full height and walked out slowly, throwing these matters to the back of his mind. He had a feeling that in these few months, there would be quite some upheaval in the Void Palace, but it wouldn't have anything to do with him. Chapter 1657, published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1657. Changes: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stepped down from Void Senate Peak with a smile on his face. He didn't really know what actions the Void Palace would take, at least not for certain, but he also didn't care very much. What he was more focused on right this moment was, as he said, squeezing out all the potential the Void Palace had to offer him. What do you want to do? Aina asked. Well, the Void Palace is good for training and for gathering up resources. I have a lot of resources at my fingertips now, but they're mostly in one box. I still need a lot of other things. Right now, we have the demon corpses, we have the Dreamstar Gathering Beast Formation, the Focus Crystals, and the Perfection Stone. Of those, the Perfection Stone and Focus Crystals are very important for our training, but we only have enough of those for the two of us. I can't build up our faction like that, especially since I have to catch up on a lot of lost time. Beyond that, most of my wealth is in ores, even most of the wealth my mother left for me is in Herb Oregon. While it's useful, they're ironically in a state that's too liquid. There were two major problems that those running an organization faced, and both were opposite sides of the same coin. The one that was most obvious was having too little money, but on the other hand, having too much money was also another problem. If you let money sit without doing anything, it was as good as not having it at all. The best organization heads were able to maximize the resources they had on hand and would usually spend almost as soon as they received. Only by money constantly exchanging hands in a cycle could an organization maximize growth properly. Of course, Lionel didn't believe he had reached such a state. In fact, I have too little money. But even though his fortune was small, he still hadn't made the best use of it just yet. Still, that's a problem for another time. Right now, since my focus is to squeeze the Void Palace for all it's worth, then the main task isn't to make my funds less liquid, but actually to increase that. At the same time, we also need to maximize our strengths and knowledge. First, I need to return to the Void Library. But in order to do that, I'll need a lot of Void points and Void merits. So the first thing we need to do is do some missions to exchange for an entry token. Aina nodded and smiled. Okay. Last time Lionel entered the Void Library, his mind had already been at the pinnacle of the 7th dimension, but he could hardly make use of it. Firstly, he had still been in the 5th dimension, so his mind was shackled by chains that had greatly loosened now. In addition, he had yet to form the star runes that he had now. Lionel believed that his performance would be much better now in comparison to the past. In fact, he was hoping that he could assimilate all the information in the Void Library. By Lionel's calculations, he was actually still far from being able to accomplish this. However, he had a feeling that pushing himself in the Void Library would help him gain more inklings into how to properly manipulate his dream force. If he could find those inklings, then his odds of success would be far greater. If he assimilated the entire Void Library, well, as they say, knowledge was power. Lionel and Aina wasted no time and immediately went to a Senate branch. Just like the past, they were all dotted all across the Void Palace. However, when Lionel and Aina attempted to trade for missions, they were stunned by the result. Sorry, there are no Void Star missions, or any missions for that matter, that meet up to your requirements. Lionel blinked when he heard this, not quite understanding. No Void Star missions? How was that even possible? Seemingly seeing Lionel's confusion, the Senate branch overseer assumed that Lionel and Aina were two recently promoted nominal disciples who were just trying to look at Void Star missions for fun. It would make sense why they were in the dark about these matters if this was the case. Often, it took the most ordinary of nominal disciples decades to climb up from their ranks and reach the main Void Palace. So, even though it had been years since everyone had all returned, they wouldn't quite understand the situation. It could be said that this overseer had a relatively good temperament. If anyone else had made such an assumption, they would have already tried to chase Lionel and Aina away. In recent years, all of the Void Star missions have been cleared by the constellation stars. About a decade or so ago, they all started a competition between themselves, and the result was all of the Void Star missions, and even the Void Death missions, all being cleared. Even the higher level sector ranked missions weren't safe. The overseer sighed, shaking his head. Most of his generation felt the exact same way. That generation was simply too outstanding, and the geniuses of Earth that followed after them were just as outstanding as well. The Void Star and Void Death missions had withstood the test of time for so long, and yet in just a couple decades, they had all vanished, forcing the Void Palace to not only adjust their difficulty ratings, but to also add special rewards for high difficulty missions. Unfortunately, due to the change in the rules, pretty much all high difficulty missions are monopolized by the constellation stars and their factions and parties. They have a direct line to the Void Senate, so the missions are snatched up before they can even appear here. The overseer shook his head. Anyway, I'm sorry I can satisfy your curiosity. There are still many normal missions to pick from here. They'll allow anything they aren't interested in to slip through the cracks. The overseer smiled and began pulling out missions he felt were on Lionel and Aina's level. But before he could continue, Lionel reached out a hand to stop them. They monopolize missions? And what if I want one of those monopolized missions? The overseer blinked. Well, that would be a bit troublesome. Although it's not explicitly stated in the rules, due to the ambiguousness of the change, claiming missions has become a free-for-all and there are certain unspoken rules now. There are many more so-called high-difficulty missions now because of Earth and its zones appearing all over the human domain. There are even signs that Earth's world will swallow up almost half of the human domain with its next evolution. There's also a lot of covert activity in the shadows by the cloud race and other enemies of humanity to contend with. But despite the sheer number of high-difficulty missions there are, the demand for them is even greater. So now there are battles to decide who can claim them, but even entering to witness these battles is a very exclusive right, let alone participating in them. Are you interested in viewing these battles for missions? I'd have to advise you against it. The tickets are too expensive, and just buying them in the first place requires a certain degree of prestige. Lionel frowned. To think that there would be so many changes. Important announcement below. Chapter 1658. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1658. Reset. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. It seemed that things would be more annoying now. He didn't think that after consuming hundreds of thousands of years of passed down laws, that just 20 or so years would be enough to change so much. But if what this overseer was saying was correct, these laws didn't even appear alongside the other ones. Due to the suddenness of the change, it had become a loose law of the jungle type situation. Lionel didn't believe that if he checked the laws now that there would be something that allowed the monopolization of missions, so it could only be said that this was being tacitly allowed for the moment due to extenuating circumstances. After a moment of thought, Lionel turned to Aina. Check to see how many void merits you have. Aina nodded and brought out her own disciple badge, but when she did so, the overseer was startled. Void merits? Did these two confuse void merits with void points? Due to the changes, void merits had become even more of a rarity than they had in the past. With the most difficult missions being monopolized by a very small minority, the chances regular students had at earning void merits had dwindled significantly. The result of this was an already rare currency becoming even rarer. If you weren't the pinnacle of your rank, the chances of you having void merits was almost nil. However, the overseer remained quiet and still checked, only to be shocked into silence. 21-24 void merits. The overseer looked toward Lionel and Aina again, suddenly understanding that he had made a mistake, a very big mistake. It had to be understood that even one void merit was extraordinarily difficult to procure. To have 100 would mean that you were in the percent of the 1%, if not even greater. He didn't even know how to categorize someone who had over 1,000. However, what confused him even more was that when he said this number, Lionel and Aina didn't look happy at all. In fact, when they looked toward each other, there was an unconcealed dissatisfaction. It was clear that they had thought of the same thing at the same time. 21-24 void merits? According to Lionel's calculations, Aina should have over 50,000 void merits by now. He had already done the calculations before. She received 27 void merits for her place on the current leaderboards and 150 for her place on the all-time leaderboards. At 177 void merits apiece, multiplied over the 23 years they had been gone, plus the 1 year Lionel spent training his spear, that should accumulate to over 50,000. This math was so easy for Lionel that he didn't even need a single second to finish them. The moment that he heard the number started with a 2, he had realized that there was an issue. 21-24 void merits was exactly the amount of void merits that Aina would have for 1 year. But they had been gone for over 2 decades and the Void Palace should have been re-established long ago. With this being the case, how could Aina have so few void merits? You too. The overseer shuddered, it clicked for him in an instant. You two just returned? It finally made sense. The only way one could accumulate so many void merits was through the use of the leaderboards. At the same time, this would explain their dissatisfaction. They were definitely expecting to see more than they got. Yes, we did just return. Can you explain to us why my girlfriend's merits aren't adding up? It wasn't just the number that was lacking. If the Void Palace chose not to count the 2 or so decades, the number Aina had was actually too high. After all, Lionel and she had used some of it before the cataclysm. But this number was exactly enough for 1 year and then it stopped. Why was that? I see. When the first batch returned from the zone, not everything snapped back into place immediately and a lot of this was unorganized. It wasn't until a good portion of the Void Elders returned that we finally gained a semblance of order. Due to this, a lot of things had to be shuffled around and reset. For those on the leaderboard, all void merits were wiped and everyone received exactly 1 year worth of what they should have, before you had to work for everything all over again. This was also necessary because things like the Void Tower and the previous Gold and Amethyst tokens rules didn't work particularly well for the Cataclysm generation. The Cataclysm generation? Lionel raised an eyebrow. Yes, that generation is the last to enter the Void Palace right before the Cataclysm struck, so that's the name they go by. As the story goes, there was a Lionel Morales who ruined a lot of things. Word said that he received an Amethyst token without properly earning it, and then he entered the Void Tower and reached a floor level that didn't make any sense. In addition, that generation had a lot of talents that would have been Amethyst token wielders in almost any other generation. So because of the pressure the human domain was under, the Void Senate thought it best to provide these geniuses a fast track. Thus, a compromise was struck. On the one side, those that came before gained a year worth of resources they earned all at once, while on the other side, all those of the Cataclysm generation that proved themselves worthy through the Cataclysm event were allowed to become Galaxy-ranked disciples directly by undergoing the Void Tower trials. Due to that, the leaderboards were cleansed and everything was reset once again, and that's why we have the situation we do now. Lionel's gaze flickered with a cold light. The Void Senate, huh? Lionel's placid expression gave way to an icy smile. So the Void Tower was reset? How interesting. Chapter 1659. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1659. Border Patrol. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina left the Senate branch, their destination all too obvious, the Void Tower. However, as though they were being led by the nose, they found yet another roadblock ahead. Lionel was already having a hard time not being visibly annoyed. The surroundings of the Void Tower made Lionel feel as though he was asking for amnesty. It was impossible to tell that this was a core region of the Void Palace that was once frequently visited by students because it practically had a border patrol now. Judging by everything else that had happened until this point, Lionel didn't even need to make too many guesses as to what was happening. Just like all the missions before them, Lionel assumed that the spots of entry into the Void Tower were being monopolized by the so-called Cataclysm generation. In the past, people would only rarely enter the Void Tower. This was firstly because exiting meant that you had experienced something akin to death, it would feel just as real and the real thing. And secondly, there was no point in continuously entering the tower due to the fact one would usually only do so when they had a great improvement in their strength. Of course, none of this even talked about the fact that only the first entry into the tower was considered to be free, while every subsequent entry cost both void points and void merits. After all, the Void Tower was considered to be a cultivation resource. But now with so many geniuses appearing that were outside the bounds of the Void Palace's normal understanding, they entered far more frequently and demanded much more space. It also seemed like there was an entry capacity limit of 3 for the Void Tower as well, something that Lionel hadn't been aware of until he casually listened in on a few conversations. I managed to get a slot for 7 months from now. That's not bad. If I had tried 5 years ago, the waiting time would have been even worse. Looks like they're slowing down. Slowing down? More like they're getting bored of the Void Tower. They used to go at it almost every day, multiple times a day before. Now it's only rarely. I don't know if bored is correct. The deaths on the higher floors are so much more gruesome. It's probably better for their health if they experience them less. Now you're just assigning your own fears to them. The truth is probably that they've reached a bottleneck. If they want to progress any further, they'll have to enter the 7th dimension first. I think that if we want to use some of the best resources of the Void Palace, this window while they're stuck at the peak of the 6th dimension is the best chance we'll get. I'm going to go and register for Sword Faction placements too right after this. I think he'll get a good date. Hearing these conversations, Lionel was truly speechless. In reality, the Void Palace had always been a somewhat lawless zone where students were allowed to butt heads and fight over resources, but this was even more exaggerated than what he remembered. They weren't just fighting over resources here, it had reached a point where they very obviously monopolized them. At the same time, the so-called geniuses of the Void Palace who were once prideful and used to peacocking, just seemed to accept it all so easily. If Lionel had been there when the Void Elders spoke of dulling his blade, he would have understood that this was why they were so confident it would happen. This was already his 3rd or 4th attempt at just doing anything in this place, and yet he kept running into roadblock after roadblock. Every time this happened, Lionel's good mood after having spent the last several days in leisure with Aina became darker and darker. Lionel couldn't help but remember the first thing that happened when he stepped foot into the Void Palace. This place, designed for the future leaders of humanity, created to curate the geniuses of the future, acted to crush their spirits before it did anything else. Lionel still remembered it. Back then, despite knowing that anarchic force corroded clothing, the overseers told them nothing and simply allowed it to happen. They wanted to strip them all naked, as though in this place, they had to beg even for clothing. Now, it seemed that sort of emasculation, that sort of infantilization, was pushed to the point where everyone here just thought it to be normal. Crushed the normal geniuses, forced them to lower their heads, only allowing the truly outstanding ones to stand out. No, it was even worse than that, because even if you were an outstanding genius while you were growing, you would still need to lower your heads to those that were much older than yourself. Lionel felt like he was watching a microcosm of everything he absolutely abhorred about society playing out for him in real time, and by the time he made it to the first checkpoint for entry into the Void Tower, his expression was as dark as thunder clouds. High above in the air, Cornelius had been following Lionel for a long while. The moment news of him being back was disseminated, he was once again given this task. Seeing the dark look in Lionel's eyes, he sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Here we go again?" he mumbled. "Would you like to register for a future spot of entry into the Void Tower? Or would you like to pay for a spectating ticket? The prices for tickets based on those participating is on the left. The price for spots depending on how long you're willing to wait is on the right. Currently, there are no normal tickets left for today's spectators as they've all been bought up. The only spots left are for VIP spectators. However, the price is expensive as the lineup today is quite good." At the checkpoint, a young man spoke with a bored voice without even looking up. It seemed that he had repeated these words again and again until he was simply tired of it all. But what he didn't expect was for a shadow to pass by him without a word. Chapter 1660. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 1660. Dare? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Adelon was startled. He had indeed become a bit bored of this job because it was nothing but repeating the same things over and over again. While watching money, he had no fate with being exchanged. However, as a member of one of the Cataclysm factions, he had great pride in his heart to be able to step foot in this place at all. He hadn't been in the Void Palace previously, and actually came after the Cataclysm generation. As such, this Void Palace was the only one he knew, and he most definitely didn't recognize Lionel and Aina. All he knew was that while this wasn't the first time someone had tried to disrupt the status quo, they all had the very same ending. Stop. Adelon shot to his feet, the intent in his eyes blazing. Although he could call the guards over with how boring this job was, how could he not want to take action personally? Plus, relying on guards wasn't necessary in the slightest. Weren't they all geniuses here? In addition, while the Cataclysm generation was the most famous, the generations that came after were very well known for their talent as well, especially as the influence of Earth spread further and further, and more geniuses began to be born beneath the halo, a world with a high degree of potential. Adelon himself was from quite a famous generation, one that entered 2 years after the Void Palace was officially re-established. As such, he was well into the 6th dimension, and the strength he had at his fingertips was not small in the slightest. It was just that he wasn't a very prominent figure of his own generation, or else how could he be manning a kiosk? His fist whistled over not even an instant after his words fell, but his roar alone had caught the attention of countless individuals. Although this wasn't exactly a quiet space, the roar of a 6th-dimensional genius couldn't be underestimated. The coldness in Lionel's eyes only flickered with more intensity. It seemed that it was true that no one remembered him, but then again, could he blame him? Even back then, how famous had he been? He was still considered to be a small-time disciple, a very long way from the sector rank and even longer from the domain rank. It couldn't be said that his name was enough to call forth winds and bring forth thunder. But this time he would make sure that it did. Lionel's head turned back and he raised a single palm. He didn't push out, nor did he apply any strength forward, he simply raised it, almost as though he was helping Adelon to spar and not seeking to harm him at all. Adelon's fist plowed forward with even more force when he saw this, but when the collision occurred, bang! Adelon froze before a miserable shriek echoed through the air. In that moment, it felt as though every bone in his arm had suddenly crumbled to dust. He fell back, frothing at the mouth and collapsing under the shocking pain. Countless gazes turned over and shock colored their faces. That kiosk worker, wasn't he a member of the Lion Pride faction? Who dared to hurt him like this? No, more importantly, who could harm a member of the Lion Pride faction so easily? Even their desk workers were experts among experts. While the crowd was thinking this, Lionel simply looked down at Adelin's convulsing body. He's barely at the standard of a middle-class demon. Even if he released his god runes, he'd be comparable to a higher-class demon at best. Is this what all these people yielded to? Lionel turned away and didn't give Adelin another glance. With the shrill screech of Adelin still echoing in the air, the so-called guards were all alerted. Today was the turn of the Lion Pride faction to take guarding duties over, and as such they were all part of this very same faction. What is going on over here? The voice rang out like a thunderous boom, but before he could even get an answer, Lionel pierced out with 2 fingers. It was as though Lionel couldn't be bothered to deal with any more nonsense. Every time he tapped at the air, blood would fly and cries would follow. His pace forward didn't pause even the slightest, but he wasn't fast either. It was like he was taking his time to ensure that this was imprinted onto the memories of all those who saw it. Members of the Lion Pride faction fell one after another. Some lost arms, some lost legs, some were punctured right through their chests, and there were even some who suffered wounds to their necks that left them in a frozen state of panic, feeling as though their lives had just flashed before their eyes. Regardless of which category they fell under, none dared to take another step, and yet the commotion only grew larger and larger to the point that even those surrounding the void tower in the depths were alerted by it. Lionel approached the second checkpoint. It was clear that these factions and parties had set up multiple such points to ensure that no one could sneak in. To enter, one would be verified and then verified again for a total of 3 checkpoints before entering the core region. Lionel's slow steps toward this second checkpoint placed a formless weight on those forming a barrier around it, a suffocating pressure threatening to squeeze all of the life out of them. A hidden purple fog danced within Lionel's eyes. And if one looked even deeper, it was possible to see it rotating about and caressing the body of a golden tablet. The presence of this purple fog seemed to project out the emotions in Lionel's chest. The skies became even darker and gloomier than usual, the ground became more black than gray, and the air became heavy, even a single breath needing all of one's strength as though a mountain was weighed down upon their chests. Bang! Right then, a young man with wild golden hair that almost looked like the mane of a lion bounded over with a single leap. Lionel had met people of this family before. Conan and Gunter were both the geniuses of the Leo family who participated in the selection with him, and he had exchanged some particularly foul words with Conan, while Gunter was more of a quiet individual. This young man here was neither of those two, but he exuded the wild aura of someone in Tier 4 of the 6th dimension. And yet, the pressure he gave off was far beyond that of the likes of Triana, who had been surpassed by the generations that came after her. Who are you? There are still people who dare do such things after so long? The young man's voice rumbled like thunder. When others saw him, their blood seized. It seemed that it wasn't a lie that special characters would be participating today, or else someone like him wouldn't appear here. He was of the same generation as Adelin, but the difference between them was akin to night and day. In fact, he had already entered Tier 7 once before he learned a special technique that allowed him to compress his god foundation and purify it. He was none other than Darien Leo, one of the few geniuses that could contend with the Cataclysm generation. Chapter 1661. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 1661. Lion's Roar. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Darien had the robust and stout figure all the men of the Leo family seemed to share. His aura was brazen and his presence arrogant. However, between Conan and Gunter, he seemed to be far more like the latter in that his disposition was quite untalkative and uncaring. If it wasn't for the given situation and the fact he truly did not recognize Lionel, he wouldn't have even bothered to say so much. But as things stood now, Lionel wasn't in a very talkative mood. He continued to walk forward, his left in hand Aina's right, and his own right hand still raised into the air. With a gentle tap, the wind rippled once again, a spiral of golden spear force manifesting like swirling rays of light that formed a vacuum in the air before speeding forward like a bullet out of a gun. Darien's eyes narrowed. When in the presence of a dense anarchic force, attacking from a distance was incredibly difficult. This was why archers were among the absolutely strongest experts the Void Palace had on hand, purely due to their being better equipped than others to deal with these challenges. To attack from a distance using not bow force but spear force was an absolutely rare concept. Although the distance that separated the two of them was no more than 8 to 10 meters, it was still enough of a gap to be insurmountable to most. Under normal circumstances, at least 80% of the Void Palace's disciples would have to close this distance in hopes of entering a bout of close combat. So just from Lionel's actions alone, Darien had already concluded that he wasn't normal. It also had to be taken into consideration that distance was a relative matter. The higher you were in dimensions, the more even seemingly large distances were completely irrelevant. In a pinnacle 7th-dimensional world like this one, 8 to 10 meters to a 5th-dimensional existence was a large one. But to a 6th-dimensional existence, it was already worth no more than a single step. If not for anarchic force, it would be a pitiful gap. But this truth only made Darian's eyes narrow further. At that moment, a golden ray enveloped Darian's body and he shot out a powerful punch, his thoughts not impeding the speed of his movements in the slightest. His gaze flashed with a ruthless light, the speed of his fist suddenly accelerating while it was already deployed. Bang! Fist and spear force met, the sound of the collision causing the ground to rumble. Dong! 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 Darian's expression warped as he was forced to take 3 heavy steps backward. The echoing of his footsteps filled in the harsh silence that suffused the air, the spectators watching with their hearts trembling. Lionel had attacked with his spear force at a distance and Darian had waited until it was in range to use his fist force in the most optimal range for himself. The former had weakened itself and hadn't even made use of a weapon, all while facing the latter which was in its strongest state. And yet this was still the ultimate result. How was that possible? Lionel's footsteps never paused, the distance between them being increased to 15 due to Darian's retreat, only to be cut down to 10 again by Lionel's slow and deliberate approach. Darian met Lionel's gaze, but all he saw was an indifferent coldness, a depth of unfathomable air that made it feel more like he was facing a towering behemoth as opposed to a young male human. His heartbeat slowed and his blood ran cold for a moment before a rush of golden force rushed through his veins, causing his skin to redden and his body temperature to skyrocket. Darian released a roar, veins popping across his forehead and his body growing a size as his muscles bulged. At the same time, his wild golden hair fluttered wildly, truly becoming like the man of a lion. Clang. Chink. Yes. The sound of armor snapping into place resounded as Darian's god runes and golden force fused into one, manifesting into a radiant defense that seemed one part beast fur and another part refined white gold metal. However, regardless of which part of it was in question, all of them had god runes floating about them, exuding a tremendous aura. Lionel continued to walk forward, his palm flipping over to reveal a spear that was an even more radiant white gold. Just the harpoon-like blade alone shimmered as bright as stars, radiating out with a light so blinding that it seemed to split the natural gloominess of the Void Palace in two. Darian slammed his gauntlet-covered fists together, a rippling force of gold spreading out into the surroundings with a mighty and unrestrained air. He stomped the ground hard. His hair rose into the skies and the roar of a beast left his lips. With a twist of his torso and hips, he unleashed one of his absolute strongest fists. In the surroundings, the weak fainted one after another, unable to withstand the roar. It felt as though consciousnesses had been gripped by the jaws of a lion and crushed with a single bite, their gazes falling into darkness. Those that were further away were lucky enough to rush back to avoid the brunt of the effects, but even then they felt their knees go weak. They knew all too well that this was one of the most basic abilities of the Leo family's famous lion pride lineage factor. However, at that moment, Lionel only casually pierced out with his spear. It looked as though he had done nothing more than tap at the air. Despite the fact he was using a spear now, the feeling was just as casual, just as unbothered, just as unhurried. And yet, the entire world seemed to fall into silence beneath the presence of that spear strike. The wind grinded to a halt. The churning black clouds above stopped moving. Darian's roar was silenced. There was only a single ray of gold that appeared before the Leo family youth's chest in a single blink, piercing past his fist and through him as though he was nothing more than the very air that had come to a stop. Chapter 1662? Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1662. Timeless relics of the past. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Darian froze, his fist still hanging out in a punching position, but its momentum having already been stripped away. He looked down at his chest, his body quivering once before he fell to his knees. He coughed, blood flowing from his mouth like a waterfall as his radiant armor dimmed and lost its corporeal air. And then, it vanished entirely, his consciousness wavering under the intense pain. Shockingly enough though, this pain didn't come from his wound. Lionel's spear force was so concentrated, so fast, so swift, that it made it feel as though he was poked through by a needle. He probably wouldn't even notice the problem until several more seconds passed by. No, what was truly the intense pain was that he had lost in a single strike to someone who was 3 tiers beneath him in strength. This wasn't something he could even fathom. He had always thought that the only reason the Cataclysm generation could suppress him was because they were older and of higher tiers than him. He thought that there was no one who could match him at the same level, even them. But today that dream came crashing down harshly. The worst part was that Lionel's steps still hadn't paused. He took Aina's hand, not sparing Darien another glance as he crossed the second checkpoint, his spear having already disappeared as though he had regretted taking it out in the first place. Darien could be considered a decent talent. However, he was still someone that Lionel felt that he could have defeated back when he was in Tier 9 of the 5th dimension so long as he went all out and used his Scarlet Star Force. At best, he was firmly within the standard of higher class demon and wasn't nearly enough for the current Lionel to take with any sort of seriousness. The more he saw of these geniuses, that could suppress the rest of the Void Palace, the more Lionel realized just how large the gap between the human domain and that zone was. Lionel and Aina approached the third checkpoint, but by this point no one dared to casually block their way, even the so-called guards didn't make a move, their eyes still locked onto the sorry state of Darien. If Darien couldn't last even a single move, what good were their numbers exactly? They would just find themselves crushed. If someone was going to stop Lionel, it would have to be those VIP guests that had already entered the core region, or maybe even one of the participants for today's events. If they got injured, who was going to help them? Their faction would help a bit, but it would still mostly rely on themselves. The most dangerous state any disciple could be in when within these mountains was injured. The Void Palace was a dog-eat-dog world. How could they put themselves at risk in a battle they knew for certain that they would lose? It was then that Lionel crossed the third checkpoint and the individuals of the core region who had heard the commotion finally came to make their presences known. It had been too long since anyone had dared to stir up a commotion in a region controlled by the Cataclysm generation. Never had they expected that today of all days something like this would actually occur. However, when they laid eyes on who it was, most tilted their heads in confusion. Who the hell was this? Tier 1 of the 6th dimension? Was this a newly admitted disciple? That wasn't impossible. The most recent recruitment selection wasn't too long ago and those freshmen should have just been allowed in. It wouldn't be unreasonable for one of them to have broken through into the 6th dimension in that time. Some of the older participants of the selection often spent years suppressing themselves and wait for the God Path breakthrough method. They looked toward one another to see if there was any among them who had a definitive answer, but all they saw was mutual confusion. It seemed that none of them were aware. The crowd, though, was well aware of the faces of these individuals. Cristal Terrius of the Terrius family. He was in Tier 5 and he was an extremely talented individual of the Bao Constellation Alliance. If Nazag was considered to be in a tier all to his own in terms of archery talent, then Cristal shared the tier right below along with a few others. Quaner Pius of the Pius family. She was in Tier 6, and if Simona was considered to be in a tier all to her own, Quaner could also be considered to be a tier right below. Wimlin Taurus of the Taurus family. He was by far the tallest of them all and standing at a height that approached 2.5 meters tall. His arms and legs were impossibly thick and he had an odd pair of shin guards that were actually a pair of radiant brass battle axes. No matter who you looked at in this group, each one was more powerful and prestigious than the last, and though they weren't a part of the Cataclysm generation, they weren't too far away. Although none of the generations following the Cataclysm generation could match up to them, it was well known that the generations that came after were far more powerful on average than the usual batches of students the Void Palace received. This was in part due to Earth's rise, but it was also said that the human domain sensed the danger it was in and was reacting appropriately. Maybe very soon, there would be a generation which even the Cataclysm generation couldn't hold a candle to. Among these individuals, though, there was one who didn't come after the Cataclysm generation but instead came before. Even though everyone was excited by what was fresh and new, this was only in regard to the holistic picture. There were still timeless experts of generations gone by that stood at the same peak at the Cataclysm generation, and this individual was the only one among the entire group that recognized Lionel. He stood tall, his arms crossed about his chest, watching as Lionel approached with a cold indifference in his eye. This individual was none other than Valor Morales, 6th Nova. "So you've returned," he said coldly. Chapter 1663. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1663. Small families. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked toward Valor, his expression still placid. He was the only one of the Morales family not recognizable at a single glance, but the others were all too easy to get a look at. The bronzed hair, tan skin, pale green eyes. It was all the exact same. It didn't seem to matter who their Morales parent chose to tie the knot with. The Morales genes always seemed to win out. Lionel had been the same in the past until certain mutations in his lineage factors caused changes to occur, but this wasn't too difficult to accept. After all, considering Earth's talent, the lineage factors birthed from there were most definitely not normal. Maybe it would take such a thing to finally make the Morales genes take a step back. The crowd was shocked when they heard Valor speak. They all knew of this young man, and his stature was no less than that of the Cataclysm generation. In fact, there was no doubt that the 6 potential heirs of the Morales family were all kings amongst men. It was just that being the young Valor was the last to have yet to step into the 7th dimension, but even so, he was only a step away. While the Void Palace counted generations by the year, the Morales family counted generation by grandfather, father and son pairings, with decades being in between. Any one of their billions of descendants that could earn the right to fight for the position of heir was an absolute monster, and they had proven this with time. Lionel had already been far behind them when he finally made it to the Void Palace in the first place, but he was placed even further behind after losing 20 years. Valor was probably the only one among them that he still stood a good chance against in a one-on-one battle. However, even with this being the case, Lionel met his cousin's gaze without much fluctuation. The heir wars were postponed for your sake. The family was quite confident that you would return. Lionel's expression flickered, a bit of his indifference receding. He could tell after these short few sentences that the coldness Valor was exuding had little to do with him. This was just his cousin's personality. Since he was willing to talk, there really wasn't a problem with doing so. The Morales heir wars had been postponed due to the events of the Cataclysm. Usually they would ensure that the heirs' wars would occur while all of the heirs were still in the 6th dimension, but this time, it had been impossible to allow this. The current plan is to wait until we all enter the 7th dimension, or else it won't be very fair. So we will all be waiting for you. Lionel paused before nodding lightly. He hadn't expected this. He had entered into this matter assuming that it would all be unfair, and he was prepared for that outcome. But it seemed that the Morales family had no intention of allowing things to be so skewed. Valor nodded back. You want to enter the Void Tower? Yes, that was my intention. Lionel responded. Okay, then enter. No one will block you. The expressions of the others had been a mix between shock and interest while they were listening to the two speak. But when they heard Valor's final words, their expressions changed. Valor, you can't just do what you want. The spots today are already claimed. What exactly do you mean by this? Wimlin spoke immediately. With Wimlin's size, despite the fact he only felt that he was talking with a normal amount of sternness, his voice came out in a thunderous boom that caused vibrations in the air. Valor turned an indifferent glance toward Wimlin but didn't say a single word. Rules? Spots? Did he ever have to pay attention to such stupid things? He had strolled in here just like Lionel had because he happened to have some time on his hands today. The only difference was that no one had dared to stop him because they all recognized his face. It was unfortunate for Lionel that he had just returned, or else most would probably give him the same amount of face. Unfortunately, even if people recognized him now, it was unlikely that they'd do so. He hadn't built up enough of a legend before the Cataclysm, and now he had lost 20 years compared to the others. Seeing that he was so blatantly ignored, Wimlin's temper flared, his battle axe shin guard shining with a radiant light as they seemed to want to unsheath themselves. However, the moment they did, a raging tempest of spear force surged around Valor. Even with his arms crossed about his chest, it seemed that he could pierce Wimlin through with a single look. Right then, it felt like the very light of Wimlin's battle axes dimmed considerably. Wimlin's expression along with the others turned incomparably ugly. Valor was in Tier 9 while the strongest of them was still in Tier 7. But even if they had been at the same level, they wouldn't have dared to casually take Valor on. At that moment, Quanner, one of the few women among them, spoke. Her approach was much different than the brutish Wimlin. I see. So in that case this must be 7th Nova and your younger cousin HM? I've heard that he's very famous, but little of it actually has anything to do with him. The first thing you think of when you think 7th Nova is his father and the latter's tyrannical ways, even chopping off the arm of a Senate Party leader. How valiant. The second thing you think of is his mother, a goddess for sure, but also a woman who let her son earn an amethyst token through some backdoor methods. The third thing you think of is his uncle, a war god amongst men, and aunt, yet another goddess, who both also happened to let him use the Spear faction's facilities for absolutely free for an entire year. And now it seems that he wants to rely on another family member again. You can do as you please, Valor. We all know that we aren't strong enough to stop you. But your Morales family seems to be getting more and more tyrannical every day. flouting the laws of the Void Palace and acting as you please. Now, you know very well who's quartered the Void Tower for use today, but you're still choosing to do this. It seems that the Morales family cares very little for the opinions of us small families, HM? Lionel's eyes narrowed. He could care less about Quaner's words. He was a person who could easily get infuriated for the sake of those he cared about, but when someone was being debasing toward himself, he didn't even find it difficult to remain completely indifferent or even entirely ignore it. The trouble was that Quaner's words seemed to be hinting at something far deeper than just a bit of nepotism, and the frightening chill in Valor's eyes, even more frigid than normal, spoke volumes toward that effect. Chapter 1664. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 1664. Buried history. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The coldness in Valor's eyes reached a tipping point. The aura he was exuding made Quaner's confident smile waver as a flicker of fear danced within the depths of her eyes. However, just when it seemed that he was about to do something, Lionel smiled and patted him on the shoulder. Thanks for your help, Valor. I'll take you up on that offer. Me and Aina would like to enter. Valor looked away from Quaner and met Lionel's gaze before nodding lightly. Without another word, Lionel walked into and through the group of young geniuses, his expression not very hurried at all. As far as Lionel was concerned, starting a massacre here wouldn't extend his time in the Void Palace. In fact, it would most definitely shorten it. The larger the commotion he caused, the more rushed his time in this place would be. But he still needed time to squeeze all the benefits he could out of the Void Palace. Although the zone seemed to have much stronger methods, Lionel didn't forego what the Void Palace had to offer either. There were still large riches of information to be had in this place and secrets that he would only be able to understand through it. If he had been able to unearth all of the secrets of the zone in one go, he might care about the Void Palace's things any longer. But he had spent too little time in there. As such, he was still in a situation where he knew too little about the wider secrets of the dimensional verse. In that case, he would make sure to rob the Void Palace of everything it had before he leisurely left with a smile on his face. The youths watched as Lionel crossed their faces without a care. He hadn't even seemed to take Quaner's words to heart. In fact, he completely disregarded them. That said, just because he didn't mean that Aina would as well. After all, didn't she have her own temper? Still holding onto Lionel's hand, she turned back with a dark glow in her eyes. Your elder brothers, sisters and cousins already lost to him once over 20 years ago. I'm afraid that 2 decades still wasn't enough to catch up. Maybe you should ask them what exactly happened in the Rapak's nest. But then again, saving you all wasn't exactly a one-time occurrence, now was it? A coercion-laced mental attack seemed to be hidden within her voice, thrumming against the mind of the youths that were present. Quaner in particular felt her heart jolt, finding, to her horror, that her nose and ears were all bleeding. Aina's words resonated like bells in their skulls, the blood running in reverse and their hearts beating hard to catch up. It felt as though if they were the slightest bit careless, their chests would implode, forming blood flowers that marked the place of their deaths. Information about exactly what had happened in the Rapak's nest had been overshadowed by the actions of Lionel's father that day and the position the Cataclysm generation had taken afterward. Having been stimulated by Lionel and Amory, they went into seclusion, wishing to make a perfect breakthrough into the God Path as quickly as possible. Back then, Conan had claimed that breaking into the God Path would close the gap between themselves and Lionel's innate node, and it seemed that many of them had agreed with this sentiment. Being spurred on by the fire of competition, they all went into hiding soon after. It was because of this that even after a year in the Void Palace, Lionel hadn't heard anything about the members of his generation, and that included even Amory, who had placed all of his focus toward the Sword Domain's tribulation. At the same time, the Sword faction of the Void Palace didn't want to reveal the details of what caused all of this to happen, or else the Sword family might have to face the ire of many families for putting their children at risk, all for the sake of allowing Amory a chance to gain a second ability index. And, of course, the second mastermind of the matter, Third Nova Zavnik, obviously didn't want to make his involvement clear either, or else the truth about him betraying the Spear faction to help the Sword faction toward his own ends would have also been exposed. Then, this ultimately came to a head when the Cataclysm descended, and such small details simply didn't seem to matter at all. Due to this, the one of the Cataclysm generation whose name should have held the most weight, Lionel Morales, was overshadowed. It also didn't help that speculations of nepotism were rampant. However, right this moment, Aina's words seemed to have jolted them all awake. She had, of course, been there. Could it be that their understanding of the situation was flawed? By the time they recovered themselves, Lionel and Aina had already appeared before the disciple manning the Void Tower and handed over their badges. "This will be our first entry," Lionel said lightly. With all of their records wiped clean, this would indeed be their first entry. Since the Void Palace wanted to play, he would happily play along with them. The disciple hesitated, but sensing the gaze of valor, he could only shiver and accept the badges, inputting them into the system and allowing Lionel and Aina to enter. Not even a half-minute after Lionel and Aina had entered, a commotion arose in the Void Tower region once again. "Simona, there's still time to back down. I'm not a fan of crushing women outside the bedroom. Of course, if you want a taste of me, I can lay my pride down and give you a night." The laughter rang out like thunder, booming to the point even the ground quaked. However, the ice beauty who seemed to be the target of it all didn't respond in the slightest. She walked slowly and in an unhurried fashion, and yet her steps carried her forward dozens of meters at a time. She had a beauty beyond words and an elegance surpassing reason. Just the small showing of soft flesh that flashed out of the slit in her dress was enough to make many swoon. Bang! At that moment, a heavy figure fell from the skies. Simona Pius and Conan Leo had arrived. But they weren't alone. Chapter 1665. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1665. Humiliation. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The third individual was a hulking man, standing at 3 meters tall and dwarfing even Wimlin. He was the genius of the Tor family, Armand Tor. Just like this, 3 geniuses of the Cataclysm generation had appeared one another, each exuding an aura that seemed to make the skies tremble and the earth crack. However, they were surprised to find that the organized region they had become used to was not only in disarray, but Conan even found that several members of the Lion Pride faction were actually bleeding out on the ground. At that moment, Conan's good mood vanished into thin air. "Who dares?" His words came out in a lion-like roar, wisps of golden force shooting out from his lips like a sonic attack. But it didn't even seem like he had done this consciously, it was more like his power had become a part of the very fabric of his being. Conan's gaze almost turned bloodshot, his eyes sweeping over the surroundings until he locked onto Valor and the others who had been approaching the tower to watch. At that moment, Conan's gaze locked onto Valor, the aggression in his expression increasing manifold. In his mind, Valor was the only one with the balls to do such a thing, and he was probably the only one with the power to dare to do so as well. "You did this?" Conan growled. The truth was that Conan's speculations weren't exactly poor. After all, Valor had indeed entered without paying what others did. If someone had been foolish enough to stop him, then this was a very possible outcome. The difference was though that no one would dare to act against Valor. However, Conan hadn't been here to see this, so there was nothing particularly wrong about his assumption. And Valor, who was a man of few words to begin with, couldn't even care to explain himself. Even if he did have the mind to explain, he still wouldn't for the mere fact that it would seem as though he was trying to avoid Conan's fury. He, Valor Morales, did not fear the likes of Conan Leo. If the latter wanted to act, he was free to do so. At the same time, Wimlin, Quaner, and the others were already dissatisfied with Valor for obstructing and oppressing them earlier, so why would they be in a hurry to help him clear his name? Conan's steps slowed as he walked forward, but the heaviness behind them only grew with every oppressive push of his gait. The surroundings quaked and even the anarchic force in the air seemed to be showing signs of swaying out of the way as Conan's fury rose like a tempest. It had been very long since anyone dared to provoke him like this. Did his Lion's Pride faction look like something just anyone could trample upon as they pleased? However, just as Conan was about to take action, Simona released a light hum. "Oh?" Her delicate brows rose as she looked up. Right then, 2 large projections manifested themselves, one showing the form of Lionel outfitted in a familiar skin-tight black suit, and another showing Aina wearing the very same thing. "Him?" Conan's voice was tinged with surprise. Lionel hadn't returned even after so long. So many who knew of his existence thought he had died. Of course, nothing would be confirmed until the spatial storm phenomena came to an end, but to think that he would truly be among the last batch. Many thought that Conan would be enraged that someone had actually dared to take his spot, but in reality, after being surprised, Conan suddenly began to laugh again, his voice booming across the horizon. This was perfect, simply too perfect. Back when the influx of geniuses forced the Void Tower to change its rules and reshuffle things around to better optimize their growth, everyone of the Cataclysm generation had entered one after another. But this wasn't the most important point. What made Conan laugh like he was laughing now was that they had also all entered at Tier 1 of the 6th dimension. If Lionel had just returned like Conan believed he did, this would mean that it had been only a year since he had met Conan, at least from Lionel's perspective. In such a case, Lionel would also, at most, be in Tier 1 of the 6th dimension. This would be an absolutely perfect one-to-one comparison. Conan himself, on that day, had managed to climb to the 42nd floor in one go, a feat that was enough to shock the whole of the Void Palace. For context, the strength of the 7th dimension began at the 50th floor, making his accomplishment at the mere first tier absolutely ridiculous. Of course, Conan hadn't performed the best, but he also claimed that it was because he was unlucky in the floors he was given, something he stood by even to this day. Regardless, if Lionel couldn't at least make it that high, then he was nothing but trash. In that situation, he would no longer have to hold back. Once Lionel came out, he wouldn't have to worry about whining about him having a 20-year advantage because he would have already proven himself to be superior to Lionel. Conan remembered what happened that day in the Rapak's nest all too well, not to mention those arrogant words that Lionel had spoken. Back then, Conan had claimed that humans couldn't coexist with powerful innate nodes and that Lionel would eventually be swallowed up by his own talent in the future. However, in response, he only received Lionel's sneers and derision. In his entire life, Conan had never experienced such humiliation, especially not for an individual of his own generations. "Don't assign limits you do to yourself to me." Those words and Lionel's brazen smirk were branded into his mind. When he came out, Conan would be sure to grind all of his bones to dust. Chapter 1666. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1666. 4 categories. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel had no idea what was going on outside, nor did he particularly care. If he had known about Conan's thoughts, he would have done nothing more than laugh. Back then he was aware of Conan's true thoughts. If Conan had been the one born with a Scarlet Star Force innate node, he would have had all the confidence in himself in the world. In such a situation he wouldn't be talking about humans, and spirituals, and their gaps. It was only because he felt that Lionel was unworthy that he had said such things. However, didn't Lionel have just as much confidence in himself? Conan could just sit tightly and watch. Lionel sent a gaze toward the weapon racks that manifested around him. He remembered what happened the last time he was here. His arm was broken, so he had no choice but to rely on throwing weapons and shields. For the first time though, he was completely healthy and he chose nothing. Under the astonished gazes of the spectators, Lionel didn't choose any weapon whatsoever and directly allowed the sequence to begin. His vision spun, and when he appeared once more, he realized that he had stepped into what could only be called the land of the dead. Lionel recognized this place almost immediately. It was because of this region that Aina hadn't been able to continue past the 12th floor during her original run. Because these enemies had no blood force to use, she ended up dying in the end. Now it seemed that it would be Lionel's first batch of 9 floors. The ground splintered and bony hands reached up. However, Lionel only sent a casual glance through the surroundings. People had forgotten his name. It was probably time that they remember. He lightly raised a foot and stamped downward. In that moment, a surge of radiant earth force compressed the ground, forcing it into submission. Silence fell over the spectators on the outside of the Void Tower. Usually, the surroundings would be filled with lively discussion, no different from a sporting event on Earth. After all of these people had paid good money to witness the events of this day, but they hadn't thought that they would see such a thing. Usually, when records were set, they would only appear on the first-time rankings. It had to be remembered that there were 2 batches of rankings, each with 2 categories of their own. There were current rankings and all-time rankings. In addition, both of these categories were separated into first entries and cumulative rankings. Normally, the cumulative rankings were hardly ever touched. This was because those monstrous domain-ranked disciples with 7th dimensional strength also entered the tower, and their speed would be far beyond what those of the 6th dimension could compare to. As a result, most only hoped to earn a name on the first entry rankings. Who would have thought, though, that in one sweep, not even taking half a minute, Lionel would lay claim to 9 of these rankings all at once? The ignorant might say that he had gotten floors that he could easily counter. But how often did such a thing happen? Why didn't others also capitalize like he had? In addition, controlling Earth force in higher dimensional worlds was among the hardest things to do. And yet Lionel had just casually stomped a foot and compressed the Earth in a radius of almost 100 meters to the point of being able to crush 6th-dimensional skeletons known for their hardness to death. Just what kind of feat was this? The 3 of the Cataclysm generation fell into silence, their casual expression becoming solemn. Lionel's vision swam as he entered the 10th floor. He remembered this floor all too well. The last time he came to this floor he lost consciousness, and when he woke up the spear domain heirloom was in disarray and the segmented cube was gone. But at the same time, his mage core had undergone earth-shattering changes and his starry-tailed fox lineage factor had reached completion. Even now he didn't quite know whether to see it as a blessing or a curse. Regardless of which it was, though, this particular boss floor wasn't the same as what Lionel had experienced in the past. At the very least, it wasn't a member of the spirituals race, but was instead a member of the Rapax. So is this how it works? You face a member of the powerful races every 10 floors? That could be interesting. Lionel smiled lightly and threw out a fist. It seemed all too casual, and yet all the sounds of the world seemed to be sucked away, leaving behind nothing more than the image of a flying fist. Bang! Lionel's fist stopped in the air, a full 20 meters away from the Rapax, and yet it sounded as though it had collided with it perfectly. The air had compressed before his fist to the extent that when it came to a stop, it felt like he had collided against solid steel. In the distance, the Rapax exploded on impact, a shower of greenish-violet blood drizzling down in a fine misty rain as Lionel stepped into the 11th floor. This time, Lionel didn't beat the all-time record, but the impact of his win was still no less horrifying. Everyone knew that the Morales family didn't specialize in fist techniques and neither did Lionel, that much they knew. This meant that Lionel had only casually decided to use a fist this time, and yet the result was the death of a Rapax at his level from over 20 meters away. Just what was going on here exactly? Lionel stepped in the 11th floor to find a familiar challenge. It was the heavy gravity floors. Ironically, this had also been his 11th floor challenge back then, but he hadn't been conscious to experience it. This time, however, he would be. His lips curled into a smile. Chapter 1667. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 1667. Churn. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The heavy gravity floors were one of the few that didn't actually require any battle. The first layer of difficulty was, obviously, the heavy gravity. The second layer of difficulty was in the so-called pillars of gravity. These pillars of gravity were regions of this seemingly blank and wide space where the gravity would suddenly multiply by thousands of times and crush you to death in an instant. In order to pass these floors, one had to cross this spacious room without dying, and of course while withstanding the generally higher gravity as well. It was safe to say then that this was another exceptionally lucky draw for Lionel. Even if he had been in the fifth dimension again, he could have crossed this room easily. He rose his foot and his figure flickered, taking an approach most saw as suicide on the heavy gravity floors. And yet he did it without even thinking twice. Gravity? Why would a member of the Morales family have to fear it? Lionel appeared on the 20th floor, his mood still quite casual. From what he could tell, in 10-floor increments, the Void Tower seemed to jump through 2 tiers of strength at a time. The boss of the 10th floor had been a Tier 2 existence, so it was likely that the boss of the 20th floor would be at Tier 4, which meant that the boss of the 50th floor would be quasi-7th dimensional. However, this standard was set to the average student of the Void Tower. While average to the Void Tower was considered to be genius level to the greater human domain, to the likes of Lionel and the Cataclysm generation, it was child's play and actually quite weak. Of course, things actually weren't quite so simple since the non-boss floors had many enemies of that level to face, while the boss floors themselves faced them off against more concentrated talent. But this was the general gift nonetheless. This was why, even standing on the 20th floor, Lionel didn't even feel a need to take out a spear. Watching as a pixie of the dwarven race flapped her wings and quickly rose into the air, Lionel only pressed out 2 fingers, causing a flash of golden spear force to rush out so quickly that it was almost impossible to track with the naked eye. Before the pixie could even get into place to draw her bow, she froze, her eyes going blank as she fell from the skies, dead. The silence was exceptionally heavy. It seemed that whether it was Lionel or Aina, both of them had no intention of allowing these matters to settle down quietly. Although Lionel had failed to break into the all-time rankings again after the first 9 floors, he didn't waste any time crushing the first-time rankings one after another. The worst part was that he didn't even seem to be putting in his full effort. Even after crossing the 30th floor and beginning to face enemies at Tier 7 and even Tier 8, they didn't seem to be putting in much effort at all. They crushed them one after another, their time still being absolutely ridiculous. By the time Lionel and Aina entered the 40th floor, any smiling and jeering that had been present had become a solemn silence. Back then when the Cataclysm generation had first entered, the fact that Tier 1 existences could battle against Tier 7 and above existences was hard for most to fathom, but they had slowly come to accept it over time. This was just the new standard for absolute genius. Seeing a new pair of individuals accomplish the same thing, but seemingly with even greater ease, was absolutely shocking, and they weren't sure how to wrap their heads around it. The likes of Wimlin and Koran had on exceptionally ugly expressions. Although they could climb to these floors as well and even make it look quite easy too, they were in Tier 6 already. When they were in Tier 1, they couldn't have hoped to be so casual. By the time one entered the 6th dimension, taking even one step forward was incredibly difficult. This was why even after 20 years of being gone, a minority had crossed into the 7th dimension. In reality, for the vast majority of those in the human domain, entering the 6th dimension was nothing more than a dream. As for the geniuses who could make it to the Void Palace, entering the 7th dimension was just as much of a dream to them. Every step was arduous and difficult. But likewise, the benefits for taking such steps was also outstanding, and one gained large amounts of power for each step you took. Crossing levels to do battle in the 6th dimension should be extraordinarily difficult. So why did they make it look so easy? Lionel's and Ana's names flooded the rankings. By the 40th floor, each of them had secured 120 void merits a month at a minimum, and that was just considering the current rankings and not the all-time rankings. If the latter was included, the totals would be even more exaggerated. And yet they showed no signs of stopping. Lionel entered the 41st floor, a familiar charismatic smile on his face. It seems that I should get a little bit more serious. He reached out a hand, causing a surge of emulation spatial force to manifest. Soon it solidified, forming a jet black spear. A pulse of light radiated from Lionel's forehead and a golden crown formed and wrapped around his head, its centerpiece being a radiant golden spear. Lionel stood in a world of a vast ocean. As far as even his own eyes could see, there was nothing but crystal blue waters. Until, that is, the skies began to rumble and the water began to churn. Chapter 1668. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1668. The gap. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. This was the first time that Lionel was in a world like this one. It felt ominous and could easily make a person feel small. The vastness of an ocean wasn't something that could be easily fathomed. Even as a person now of the 6th dimension, it still filled Lionel with thoughts of inferiority in a way that even the vastness of space couldn't. However, Lionel still faced it all with a smile, the tip of his spear trembling slightly. Right then, suddenly and without any sort of precursor, Lionel stepped forward and pierced. His movements were fluid and without hitching, everything about his form touching onto a pinnacle of perfection that most couldn't fathom. With every step he took, the waters rippled. And with every pierce, they split apart. Waves rose and the blue waters rushed upward like a pair of tsunamis, seemingly looking to swallow Lionel whole but being completely unable to crash down around him as his movements only became more and more fierce. 1 step, 2, 3. The creatures lurking in the vast blue ocean couldn't even complete their attacks or surface. The moment they touched the dome of Lionel's senses, he would pierce outward, his motions unhurried and unbothered. His spear force seemed to reap god runes. Mighty constructs that could instill fear in others didn't seem capable of even causing Lionel's expression to change. Whether it was soft and weak flesh or sturdy and hard-scaled, his spear pierced through them all just as easily, a radiant golden light flourishing around him as though he was insistent on becoming the new center of the world. Lionel's spear spun in his hands, a mighty scythe of gold splitting the ocean in two. The water rushed away, only to reveal an enormous leviathan-like creature which didn't even get the chance to roar out in pain before it was split into two, its eyes turning vacant even as the ocean's walls crashed down around it once again. Lionel looked down beneath his feet without much of a change to his expression. Then he took a step forward, vanishing into the next floor. Lionel could feel the difficulty increasing. It was as though the closer he got to the 7th dimension, the further along an exponential curve that he traveled. The burden placed on him wasn't very great at all. After all, he still hadn't used much more than a fraction of his strength or trump cards. But he could feel that the gap between the floors was steadily growing larger and larger. When Lionel crushed Conan's record, surpassed the 42nd floor, cruising through the 43rd and rushing up the 47th, he finally felt that he was reaching a point where more and more of his strength was being forcefully squeezed out and less of his casual strikes were effective. At the very least, he could no longer just tap the air with a pair of fingers and expect that to claim victory. Everyone watching had expected something like this to happen. The gap between the 6th and 7th dimensions was simply too enormous. Even the likes of the Cataclysm generation, despite having reached the peak of the 6th dimension, wouldn't dare to say that they could face off against even the weakest individual of the seventh dimension, and that was fundamentally because such a saying was an oxymoron. There were no weak individuals who could enter the seventh dimension. They didn't exist. And this was especially so for those who took the God path. Due to the specific characteristics of the God path, improving in it was far more difficult than the conventional path. Someone on the conventional path, so long as they had a bit of talent, could force their way into the seventh dimension through the use of time, effort and resources, a lot of resources. However, someone in the God path could not do this. No amount of resources could allow you to progress in the God path. The only method of advancing was through comprehension. Only then could you accumulate the force necessary for your breakthrough. The leap necessary to cross from the sixth dimension to the seventh was absolutely enormous. Theoretically, even if one had entered the sixth dimension with the God path, you could continue through from Tier 1 to Tier 9 mostly using methods of the conventional path. But, upon reaching the pinnacle, unless your understanding of your God path reached a certain level, it would be a foolish dream to think of entering the seventh. If the sixth dimension was where the beginning of the God path lay, the seventh was where it blossomed and grew, and without proper fertilization and enough soul, this blooming would fail 10 out 10 times. This was the simple truth. As a result of this, there were enormous gaps between sixth-dimensional individuals. This was why members of the Cataclysm generation could fight Tier 7 individuals right out the gate, and also why Lionel and Aina could do so as well. This was a difference in quality in the paths they had taken. Now, Lionel was experiencing this firsthand because in the quasi-seventh dimension was the first quasi-realm where there was a magnitude of difference in the title it held. To be a quasi-seventh dimensional existence was akin to be like a demigod among the mortals of the sixth dimension. So when Lionel crossed from the 47th floor into the 48th and felt the pressure radiating from the waters below, his own expression couldn't help but turn cold, his casual smile giving way to something serious for the first time. Lionel stretched his spear out and squeezed his palm, causing it to shatter into motes of light that quickly reformed into the body of a bow. His hair fluttered wildly as a cyclone of water formed beneath his feet. He drew his bow, his back stretched tight and his aura calm. Divide. Lionel released, the water beneath him splitting before even coming into contact with his bow force. On the other end, a whale the size of a small island had its head shredded into pieces, but Lionel had already drawn his bow once again ready to fire. Now things were getting fun. Important announcement below. Chapter 1669. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 1669. Not again. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's battle intent blazed. Everything within the surrounding several kilometer range seemed to be in the palm of his hands. Even the water was completely incapable of impeding his forward progress. It was an all-out slaughter. The moment Lionel grew the least bit serious, nothing seemed capable of withstanding even a single strike. He stood tall and straight, the speed of his aiming and drawing reaching an unconscious level. Those that were watching had already felt that his spearmanship was near untouchable compared to his peers, but it was only now that they came to understand that compared to his archery, all other things fell by the wayside. It was like Lionel's spear was nothing more than scrap paper he used to test out and refine the ideas he had for his bow. All of his abilities seemed to be amplified by a factor of tenfold at a minimum in the presence of his bow. If it wasn't for the fact his emulation bow force wasn't quite as good at emulating bowstrings, his lethality would be on a completely different level. Even with this being the case, with every pluck of his bowstring, Lionel found another flaw and tweaked it. What those on the outside couldn't see was that only a small part of his attention was placed on aiming and firing, with a much larger portion being focused on refining his control over his emulation spatial force. Lionel knew that he was still greatly lacking in comparison to Thela despite his far superior dream force affinity. He was able to mask a lot of his deficiencies because the illusion abilities of his emulation spatial force were so powerful thanks to this affinity of his. However, when it came to manipulating the underlying spatial force, he still needed a lot of work. When creating something like a spear which was in line with the inherent rigidity of emulation spatial force, it was relatively easier. But it was difficult to emulate the tension and flexibility of a bowstring. He even struggled quite a bit with the bow's body as well. While others saw a bow that looked perfect in form, only Lionel, who was actually using the bow, knew that it was actually handicapping his abilities. He would face the same problems if he needed to form a more flexible spear as well. It was possible to circumvent this entirely by using his Aurora domain, but he felt no need to go so far just for a mere void tower. While Lionel planned on absolutely crushing the records of those in his generation, He had no plans of going so far as to expose the true depths of his strength. He had also told Aina to hold back as well. There were definitely individuals watching them from the dark right this moment, but they would never be able to guess at the true depth of strength they possessed, and they would be even more hard-pressed to guess at what kind of strength he and Aina could display when they fought together. That said, Lionel really wanted to experience just what kind of power someone of the seventh dimension. Or, more accurately, he wanted to know what someone who had entered the seventh dimension with the God Path could do. Bang! The ocean churned and roared. For a moment, it looked as though the entirety of its volume was rushing into the air. Lionel stood indifferently amidst it all, a heavy rain falling from above. But at a glance, it was hard to differentiate the drops of blue from the drops of violet, making it impossible to tell the difference between the ocean's waters and the rain of oceanic beast blood. Lionel took a step forward, leaving the depths of the 49th floor and entering the 50th. The outside of the void tower was still shrouded by a deathly silence. Valor watched with the same cold expression. It was difficult to tell exactly what was going on in his mind. However, when it came to Conan, his heart was always worn on his sleeve. The latter's expression was so dark and gloomy that even his golden aura seemed to dim into a dark gold. There was simply no excuse. The oceanic warbeast floors were among the most dangerous for those without water force affinity. In fact, although it wasn't classified as one of the drawing dead floors, it was very close to that for many. And yet, Lionel had made it look easy. Even if he had a water force affinity, he clearly didn't rely on it, never mind the fact that most assumed that his greatest reliance was his earth force due to his identity as a Moralis. For those of the Moralis, this was the absolute worst floor to be given. But, he had actually set a new record. Coran's own expression was quite ugly. If making it to the 40th floor meant that Lionel had earned the right to stand on the same level as them, entering the 50th meant that he had left the likes of her and the others far behind. If it was added that he was only at Tier 1, then only the likes of the Cataclysm generation and the few monsters like Valor even had the right to meet his gaze. However, when Coran saw what opponent Lionel received on the 50th floor, her heart trembled before a bit of the solemnness in her heart faded. If it wasn't for the fact that she didn't want to come off as narrow-minded and worried for her image, she would have started laughing uproariously. That said, Cornelius, who was hidden high in the skies, reacted much differently. "Oh no, please not again." He hesitated, wondering if he should forcibly put a stop to things. Lionel appeared in a familiar world of white, facing off against a young man who was too handsome for words. It was as though a goddess had personally refined each and every one of features. But he only seemed to have eyes for the tree by his side and the singular golden apple that hung from it. After a brief moment of surprise, Lionel suddenly grinned wildly. Chapter 1670. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1670. Clash. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As spiritual. For the first time since Lionel and Aina had cleared their first floors, a commotion broke out beneath the void tower. However, this commotion was more lament than anything else. They wanted to see how far Lionel could go, but they didn't want to see him draw dead so early on. Though this couldn't be considered early on any longer. A few had heard of what happened last time Lionel had entered the Void Tower, but they were in the minority. A large portion didn't even know the name Lionel Morales outside of the weight the Morales name held until this moment. However, as impressed as they were by Lionel's performance, the legend of the spirituals was simply too deeply ingrained. They were a race of people that stood at the pinnacle of the dimensional verse. If it wasn't for the fact they didn't seem as eager as the other races were to claim a piece of the human domain for themselves, they might have long since fallen. When it came to races that could hold a candle to the spirituals, only the mysterious ones like the void beasts could hope to. But when it came to numbers, many of these races couldn't hope to match up. They had not only the talent but the numbers. It made them probably the greatest threat in the whole of the dimensional verse. Although no one dared to claim this to be absolutely certain and infallible since the universe was simply too large, no one would argue too fiercely against it either. In the face of the spirituals, the human race was so frail that they couldn't battle unless they brought soul protective treasures with them. If you lacked one, it was an automatic loss. Many wondered why it was that the Void Palace insisted on allowing the spirituals to take part in the Void Tower since they couldn't bring any treasures in with them, but after so long, it had simply become an accepted reality. Now it was simply known as drawing dead. They could only wait for Lionel to be expelled. But it was then that Lionel's wild grin was projected to them, causing their hearts to jolt. That wild grin. The older generation was all too familiar with it. It was the grin of those madmen of the Morales family. Lionel squeezed his fist, causing the bow construct in his hand to shatter in motes of emulation spatial force. Come. Lionel's voice pervaded the world. In this battle he didn't want to use his bow or his spear. He wanted to battle this spiritual on its battlefield. At that moment, Lionel's words caught the spiritual's attention, causing it to look from its golden apple toward him. It's over. Many mumbled these words to themselves. Many had entered that boss room before and it always ended the same way. So long as you remained silent and unmoving, the spiritual wouldn't care about you. But the moment you made noise or even sneezed, it would look at you and then things would come to an end just that fast. However, bang. A spatial barrier rippled before Lionel's head, shattering the soul attack the spiritual had sent toward him. But likewise his spatial barrier shattered as well. However, Lionel's grin only became wider. As expected, he could rely on emulation spatial force to block soul attacks because it was fused with dream force. As such, it could interact with things on a soul level. The spiritual race man tilted his head to the side, seemingly surprised. Last time Lionel had been here, it had reacted the same way when he dodged its attack. But this time, Lionel had taken it head-on. He didn't need to rely on this spiritual to attack his soul this time. Right now he just wanted to crush it. The spirituals were powerful, right? Well, he wanted to see it for himself. Lionel raised his arms, his starry spirit domain flourishing as countless force arts formed in the air. In their midst, the snaking form of a flood dragon took shape, roaring with a menacing light in its eyes. In just a moment, Lionel had not only completed dozens of Camelot mage arts, but also an enormous beast construct, all of which used his Scarlet Star force. Show me what you have. If you don't, it'll burn your tree to ash. Hearing these words, the spiritual's expression suddenly warped, becoming malevolent. In an instant, it had gone from a docile angelic young man to furious war god. His body grew by a size, a towering tempest of green force surrounding his body until it covered his white robes in a radiant wooden armor. In a blink he went from just about 3 inches shy of 6 feet to over 7 feet. The spiritual rose his own arms, the skies being filled with green-gold arrows of force. It was clear that while Lionel had to rely on his dream world to accomplish such a feat, the spiritual relied on nothing more than his own affinity for the elements. Lionel was a bit startled by the change, but then he laughed. This was precisely what he wanted. In a moment, an eruption of force filled the air. 2 young men stood over 100 meters apart, and yet they seemed to control the entirety of the area that separated them. Boom, boom, boom. Fire and wood clashed, and yet Lionel seemed to have no ability to burn the young man's attempts at countering him to ash. He should have had a suppressive ability just due to his elemental advantage, or so he thought, but things simply didn't work out that way. And yet, Lionel's eyes only glowed fiercer and fiercer, his mage arts becoming swifter. With a point of his fingers, several spatial arrows hid under the blasts of his flames, converging toward the spiritual from all sides. Another silence fell over the surroundings of the Void Tower. Watching the fireworks of force, they found it hard to believe that just 2 people could even output so much force. Were they even human? Well, one of them definitely wasn't. As for the other one, they weren't entirely sure anymore. Lionel flipped his palms to the skies, causing 2 balls of fire to appear. In a second they pulsed to over a foot wide. In another second they pulsed to over a meter wide. However, with a slight fluctuation and a flicker of his irises, they vanished into thin air. He really wanted to see how far this spiritual could go while wasting half of its power protecting its precious tree. If it didn't go all out, he didn't mind crushing it to dust in the name of all the human youths it had unceremoniously slaughtered until this point. Chapter 1671. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1671. Wager if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The gaze of the spiritual race youth flashed, a shuddering sense of danger overwhelming him. It felt like a cataclysm was descending, but he couldn't see where it was coming from. However, when Lionel's 2 enormous balls of fire entered a certain range of him, the fluctuations of force made the spiritual's brows twitch. He released a roar, his hands pressing out as the green-gold force around him changed toward a much more resplendent gold. Vines of gold manifested from the countless arrows in the sky like fine filaments. They quickly wrapped around the floating arrows like a skeletal armor before shooting forward. Bang, bang, bang. The emulation spatial force Lionel had used to hide his twin pair of fireballs trembled like rippling waters. Although they didn't entirely collapse, the wild ripples made it look like reality itself was distorting, making their forms all too obvious to the naked eye. Even the likes of Lionel couldn't account for the speedy changes fast enough to continue to hide them beneath the illusion. But they had already approached close enough. Lionel hadn't tried very hard to hide their approach in the place. Lionel's fingers moved and the shell of emulation spatial force collapsed and the fireballs within exploded, a huge torrent of flames surging forward, enveloping the spiritual youth from all sides. The heat was blistering. The air crackled and popped, the last dregs of moisture seemingly being suffocated toward a bitter end. The spiritual race youth clapped his hands, the vibrant golden threads taking form again and forming an enormous cocoon. Flickers of fury danced in his gaze as he enveloped both himself and his precious tree, treating Lionel like the worst enemy of his life. With a stomp of his feet, green force manifested out from the ground and shredded the picturesque white scene to pieces. In one moment, it was a land of white, and in the next, it became like a forest of death, vines that wanted nothing more than to squeeze the life out of Lionel converging from all sides. Lionel's gaze flickered. He had realized by now that the spiritual youth's force was actually a combination of wood force and metal force. The former carried characteristics of life and water, while the latter also carried characteristics of life, but its secondary characteristic was quite defensive and powerful. It wasn't accurate to call it wood force. Wood force was similar to ice force, in that it didn't truly exist, it was rather a fusion of earth force, life force and water force. But that was what made the young man's force so shocking. If Lionel counted correctly, this singular force was a fusion of at least 5 or 6 forces, making its characteristics incredibly difficult to pin down, and this was even more so for its weaknesses. At the same time, the spiritual race youth seemed to be capable of amplifying and retracting these characteristics one by one at his own wishes. When he faced Lionel Fire Force, he amplified the water force characteristics of his wood force. When he wanted more offensive power, he leaned into the more offensive nature of his force's metal characteristics. When he wanted to defend, he would tap into the defensive characteristics of his force. He switched between them so unimaginably smoothly that there wasn't the slightest hint of delay between them, and Lionel couldn't even seem to find an opening. Lionel was completely fascinated. Was this a version of force manipulation? Was it precisely force manipulation? Or could it be considered to be one of the many steps along the journey of improving one's force manipulation? Bang, 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 bang. The battle raged on. Half an hour. 1 hour. 2. By this point, the number of individuals who had heard of what was going on were too numerous. Many rushed over to see exactly what was happening, only to be shocked by the fact that the rumors truly weren't exaggerated. There really was a human among them who was fighting a spiritual in head-to-head combat. At that moment, Aina calmly exited the Void Tower. She looked up toward the image everyone was so enraptured by with a light smile on her face. Maybe only she could tell that Lionel wasn't really trying to win this battle. His mage arts were probably by far his weakest aspect right now, and the Scarlet Star Force he was using was still fifth-dimensional. But seeing how shocked and awed everyone was, a hint of pride flickered with the depths of her golden irises before she blushed toward her own reaction. She had almost forgotten that she was in public for a moment. Aina turned her head away and her brows rose when her gaze landed on Simona. She remembered this beauty quite well. The two of them had fought during the selection and she had lost to Aina by a few moves. Right now, Aina could see the battle intent radiating from Simona's eyes and she matched it with a smile of her own. She had just remembered that Lionel was quite behind in terms of recruiting right now and she had promised to bring Simona over to their side. "Do you want to fight?" Aina asked with a sweet smile that seemed to pull the attention of everyone even given the current circumstances. Simona's gaze flickered, her radiant purple irises growing a shade brighter under Aina's clear provocation. "We can fight, I don't mind. But isn't it only fun to fight if there are stakes?" Simona's brows furrowed. By this point, even more attention was taken away from Lionel. Was the last member of the Cataclysm generation to return about to challenge the current seats already? "What do you want?" "It's nothing too important," Aina said with a smile. "If you lose, you just have to help Lionel with the air wars. How about it?" Simona's eyes jumped. A member of the Constellation families aiding a Morales in their air wars? Especially one of her standing? Such a thing would be quite unprecedented and there was even a tacit taboo against it. Chapter 1672. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1672. Remembered, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bang. Aina flipped a palm and brought out her battle axe, allowing it to crash heavily to the ground. She stood valiantly behind it, her long cascading black hair dancing in the wind. They had just witnessed her clear the 50th floor. She should have been mentally fatigued even if she wasn't physically so. And yet, she seemed all too eager to battle once more. No, battle might very well not be the right word, she looked like she was eager to crush everything in her path. Many watching couldn't help but feel their hearts flutter. Aina was truly too beautiful, the kind of beauty that could only be matched by the likes of Simona and the other beauties on the queen rankings. If it wasn't for the fact that Aina had vanished for over 2 decades, there was no doubt in their minds that she would have been one of the top queens if not the top queen by now. Several gulps rang out in the crowd, their hearts beating wildly. Aina's beauty wasn't a complete unknown, some had heard of her in the past. But whatever lust they had had could only be controlled due to Lionel's background. The fact that Aina and him were so close likely meant that she was an already acknowledged daughter-in-law of the Morales family. Due to this halo, there were certain things that males most definitely could not do and only women could get away with. For example, Triana's cruelty. There were certain tacit understandings that had been accepted through the ages. Bottom lines like death, castration and rape were not allowed. Things that could harm the prestige or foundation of powerful families of the human domain were not allowed. So for a beauty like Aina, they could only watch from afar, their hearts thrumming from within their chests. Simona's frown deepened. She did want to fight Aina, and her impression of Lionel wasn't bad since he had indeed saved her back then, but this Aina clearly didn't understand the underlying rules the nobles of the human domain played by. "I cannot accept this kind of bet," Simona finally responded, her voice tinged with the usual hints of ice. "Oh, is that so? Unfortunate." Aina seemed to be bored after hearing this response. With a flip of her palm, her battle axe vanished and she turned her attention back to Lionel. By this point, both Lionel and the spiritual race youth were covered in wounds. Lionel's defenses were weak to precisely what the spiritual race youth was the most powerful in force, so it was no wonder he was in such a sorry state. The ground beneath Lionel was suddenly split open and a vicious vine tunnel upward, piercing through his bottom jaw and up and out of his skull. At that moment, Lionel's gaze flickered. In a real battle, he could use the moment his enemy thought he had died to launch a vicious counterattack. He could then use instant recovery. But at the moment, he had no choice but to allow himself to fade away. "Fair play, I lose this time," Lionel shook his head inwardly. Lionel could only sigh. Even while wasting half of his strength protecting his precious tree, Lionel had still lost. Of course, it could be said that Lionel had held back at least half if not more of his strength as well by only competing in force manipulation, but Lionel was still disappointed. However, it wasn't all bad. From beginning to end, Lionel had focused the entirety of his ability index on analyzing and teasing apart the intricacies of how the spiritual used his force. Once he consolidated his findings after another trip to the Void Library, his strength should take another massive leap forward. Lionel's head cleared and he stepped out from the Void Tower, only to find hundreds of gazes locked onto him. Lionel had never been a shy person, so he only smiled lightly, his cheery grin making those in the surroundings feel like a spring breeze had just passed by. "You lost." Aina's voice snapped Lionel out of his glorious moment, causing him to cough. "That spiritual was a tough nut," Lionel said in his defense. "I climbed higher than you," Aina said with a beaming smile. "Is this your way of telling me you're stronger?" Aina nodded seriously. "Okay," Lionel laughed. "You can be stronger, but it'll still beat you 10 times out of 10. Shameless boasting." Aina rolled her eyes. "It's shameless to speak the truth now? How lamentable." Aina shook her head and laughed. She could tell that Lionel had been serious the first time he said it, and he was also serious this time. But she was still serious in her own response too. She didn't think she would lose. "Look at that defiant look in your eyes. It seems that I didn't teach you enough of a lesson last time." Lionel's grin turned lewd, causing Aina's face to suddenly blush red. "What are you saying?" She whispered harshly. "Be louder, why don't you?" "Louder? Is this Lou?" Lionel received an elbow to the gut, sapping his body of all its air, before he could make it halfway through his shout. He could only cough through the pain while keeling over. Those watching this scene suddenly felt the need to punch something. "It's fine to flirt, we get it, you're in, but do you have to do it here? Anyone have a lightning force crystal? I suddenly want to take a bath." Lionel and Aina laughed between the two of them as though no one was there. They didn't seem to sense the gazes of battle intent in the slightest. "It's unfortunate," she said. She couldn't accept the bet. "We'll have to find others," Aina said. "Oh, I suddenly remembered something." Lionel flipped his palm over, causing a snow globe to appear. Within it, a little purple puppy floated. When Simona saw this scene, her body shivered uncontrollably from head to toe, her eyes reddening. Chapter 1673. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:25 and 7 seconds p.m. Chapter 1673. 2 options if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. This purple puppy was none other than Simona's companion from all those years ago. All this time, Lionel had kept it in a snow globe because he hadn't had a chance to give it back to her. Back then, Lionel and Aina had found it in the Rapak's nest, but not wanting to deal with a beast they weren't familiar with in battle, chose to put it away instead. By the time they met Simona again, they were already in the core region of the Rapak's nest and things were too hectic for Lionel to care about such things, especially considering the appearance of the three-finger cult had left him completely infuriated. Then, when they exited the Rapak's nest, Lionel was heavily injured and once again had other things to worry about. Not long after returning, not only had Simona and the others of the Cataclysm generation disappeared, but Lionel was then thrust into the Void Tower where the shocking event that sealed his segmented cube away and brought forward the date of his spear domain tribulation would occur. With all of those things happening, Lionel couldn't possibly think to care about a little puppy he had no relation with. But when he saw the tears in Simona's eyes, he felt quite bad. If he had tried a bit harder, it wouldn't have been a problem to get the little one back to her, but the honest truth was that he hadn't tried very hard at all. To him it was a meaningless thing, but to Simona she thought that she had lost her best friend for over 20 years. Her relationship with the little purple puppy was no less than Lionel's own relationship with little Blackstar. Lionel walked forward with Aina and released the little puppy from the snow globe. The little guy looked around in confusion, but when it saw Simona, it yipped with happiness, diving into her arms completely oblivious to how long had passed. Simona, the ice beauty that everyone had come to know, couldn't help it anymore and broke down in tears. Ah, Lionel scratched the back of his head. The emotions themselves didn't make him feel uncomfortable, it was more so that he felt bad that he was probably the reason they came out in a torrent like this. She might have not reacted like this had he found a way to get her companion back right after the Rapak's nest. Thank you. Thank you, Simona spoke between sobs. Seeing her being so grateful for something like this, Lionel didn't know what to say. If anything, it only made him feel more guilty. Ah, it's no big deal. I just happened across the little guy in the Rapak's nest, but things were too hectic to find time to return her home. Sorry about that. Simona tried to speak but ended up just shaking her head again and again. Lionel obviously wouldn't know how important this little purple puppy was to her. Only she knew how slow her progress was in recent years without this little one by her side. The Pious family was very powerful in their own right, but Simona had another lineage that relied heavily on beast companions. All this time, she had only been able to tap into a portion of her potential because she had lost her life partner. She had been infuriated for a long time before that fury became helplessness. She knew that the little one was still alive due to their connection, but she had never been able to sense exactly where it was, making her feel that all of it was an illusion. Everything was fine now, everything was more than fine. Simona bit her lip heavily. She wanted to repay Lionel for this debt, but she hadn't said those words casually. She truly couldn't act personally. If the Constellation families acted personally, it would no longer be a matter of the younger generations, but instead feel much more like a domain war of the human domain. There was a reason why the likes of Valiant Heart Mountain could participate in the past, although they were among the very weakest. Lionel waved a hand. There's really no need to care about it so much, it took no effort on my part and I even delayed it for so long. Simona shook her head, only Vei slowly regaining her bearings. She took a breath and exhaled. I cannot participate and my Pious family cannot, but my paternal family can. I will gather their support for you. Lionel blinked but didn't think too much of it initially. He didn't know much about Simona's much more famous maternal family, let alone her clearly less famous paternal family. So it was hard for him to gauge what this meant. But at the same time he didn't have much support to begin with. His greatest reliance was probably the Oryx and the Umbra family. He probably couldn't even rely on Earth too much anymore because from what he had heard, it had become a behemoth in his absence. If the Constellation families couldn't participate because of how strong they were, this would be doubly true of Earth, especially considering the somewhat politically charged state it was in. After all, Earth was the central reason why the other domains were turning their eyes toward the human domain. Knowing this, Lionel would take whatever help he could get so long as this help was willing to listen to him and be of use to him. What good was help that was arrogant and uppity? They would be a net negative to his situation instead of a help. However, although Lionel's and Aina's expressions were a bit blank before they smiled, Valor's gaze along with many others flashed with a fierce light. If one had to rank which families would have the largest impact on the air wars, there would be many that could be placed within a tier of their own in terms of usefulness. These were families a step beneath the likes of the Constellation Alliances, the Morales and Seward, but had strength of their own that could still be considered strong, or they had special abilities and resources that were of great help. These could be special abilities like weapon forging, force pill concocting, or beast taming. This was truly a nice pie that had fallen into Lionel's lap from above. That family was quite known for their stubbornness, and they liked to stay out of worldly affairs, preferring to worship their god and be one with nature. But if it was Simona speaking on behalf of them, Valor already knew that things might very well change this time around. Lionel smiled. Then I will have to thank you in advance. I'm sure everyone knows that I'm quite far behind, so I need all the help that I can get. Lionel's laughter made many smile beside themselves. When he wasn't slaughtering people with the point of a finger, he truly did seem to be quite amiable and approachable. Lionel wanted to say more before he killed the time between now and when his earned void merits were paid out, but before he could, a looming shadow appeared over him. Lionel's eyes narrowed, his amiable smile vanishing as he looked forward. With how tall he was, Lionel rarely did anything but look down, but this person was able to meet his gaze on a level playing field. Conan Leo. I can admit that your performance was outstanding, but regardless of how you looked, a tier 1 is still a tier 1. I want challenge in my capacity as an individual, as I would gain no satisfaction from winning such a battle. I will wait for you to enter tier 9 first. However, in my capacity as a faction leader, with how many of my men you've left beaten, bloodied and crippled today, I have no intention of letting you off. So I'll give you two options. The first is to apologize to each one of my men personally. So long as you do this, I will leave you be until you can grow to my height. If you do not want to do this, there is still a second option. Break one of your bones for each one of my men that you've hurt today. Do that and I will also let you go. Make your choice. At that moment, the blood of the Lion Pride faction youths boiled, looking toward the back of their leader. They gripped their fists hard, their eyes reddening and a dense golden force wafting from them all. Together, the pressure they gave off seemed to make the air tenfold heavier. Lionel met the gaze of Conan. I'll return your two options with two as well. Piss off or taste my spear, which will it be? Chapter 1674. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 and 1 second p.m. Chapter 1674. Hushed silence. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. A hushed silence overcame the surroundings after Lionel's words fell. But very quickly, the skies seemed to rumble as Conan's expression turned malevolent. Lionel's hair blew backward under Conan's aura, his shirt and sweats being pulled against his body as though they might fly into the distance at any moment. However, all such momentum did was reveal just how defined the lines of Lionel's physique were and emphasize just how indifferent he was in the face of such strength. There's no need to say anything, Lionel suddenly spoke. However, it was clear that the target of his words wasn't Conan. Instead, they were for Simona and Valor. Since he wants to dig his own grave, let him dig it. Lionel hadn't vented all of his frustration just yet. He didn't want to let anyone interfere. When it came to dealing with the likes of Conan, he really wanted to see if he deserved the amount of arrogance he was exuding right this moment. In the human domain, Lionel didn't fear anyone beneath the seventh dimension. Bang! The ground between the two of them cracked and shattered, and yet when it seemed that the earth beneath Lionel's feet would throw him off balance, it was as though the cobweb-like patterns had run into a wall. The ground around Lionel lifted off from the ground but couldn't approach him in the slightest. Conan's gaze flashed with a murderous glint. As for Lionel, a cold smile flickered in his own. For an instant nothing happened. But in the next moment they moved at the same time, Conan's fist splitting the air and Lionel's palm flipping to reveal a piercing spear. The clash sent sparks of force flying in all directions, a tempest of wind forcing the weak to fly hundreds of meters backward. Anarchic force rolled and the dark clouds above trembled. The roar of a majestic lion rippled through the surroundings from one side, but on the other, there was nothing but absolute silence. Aina, who had been right by Lionel's side, narrowed her eyes, a killing intent dancing in the depths of her irises. But realizing that she probably shouldn't interfere, she took a light step backward, crossing dozens of meters at once and crossing her arms about her chest. Bang! The ground beneath Lionel's feet finally shattered as a bronze aura erupted around his body, dispersing all of Conan's power away from himself. At that moment, Conan took a single heavy step backward while Lionel didn't move at all. It was nothing more than a single exchange, but the result left those watching in shock. It felt like a calm lake had suddenly suffered the barrage of an avalanche of stones, furious currents of water spreading out in all directions and even drowning the shores. Conan had actually lost the exchange by a small measure. The difference was too striking. Conan was adorned in valiant beast cloth formed by the furs of some of the strongest beasts to exist in the human domain. He looked ready for battle, the picture of manliness and the ideal archetype of a general of war. However, on the other side there was Lionel. He hadn't even bothered to put on the uniform of the Void Palace because his original uniform had long since been destroyed. He wore the most common clothing of third-dimensional Earth, a simple pair of gray sweatpants and a plain white shirt. Although the two of them were exactly the same height, both standing at over 2 meters tall, just due to the difference in their presentation, most subconsciously believed that Conan was far larger and far more powerful. The result was the illusion of David meeting the Goliath, but this David seemed to have no need for skill or tactics. He could meet Goliath head-on without taking even a single step back. Shirring, clang, clang. Lionel's absolute spear domain whirred to life, a tornado of golden spear force revolving around him. At that moment, he went from a casual young man who looked as though he had just rolled off his couch to a valiant warrior. His hair lifted into the air, its pale violet color shimmering with a delicate white-gold light. Conan looked down at his feet, seemingly not believing that he had been forced to take a step back. By the time he looked back up, his golden eyes blazed with an undisguised fury. He slammed his fists together, his rage rising like a tsunami. The roar of a lion echoed once more, but Conan's lips were sealed tight. The manifestation of his god runes alone seemed to be more than enough to cause this phenomenon to appear. His hair grew, his beard increasing in volume. His pupils dilated and his body grew an entire foot. Claws extended from his fingers and his arms and thighs grew another size. Even with his lips sealed close, a pair of fangs slowly manifested, cutting down the length of his skin and taking droplets of blood with it. He stood to the tips of his toes, the flat of his feet extending in size as his calves pulsed with power. Just standing there, he released an undisguised bestial aura. Conan, a man who was known for his talkativeness, suddenly became deathly quiet until he growled. Bang! Conan appeared before Lionel in the blink of an eye, but the latter had already raised his spear. The exchange was short and lasted no more than a split moment before they vanished and clashed once again. The two were so fast that it wasn't until their fourth clash that the sounds began to reverberate and the violent ripples of wind reached the others. Bang! 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 Lionel's spear drew lines that split the skies. Conan's fists caused everything in its path to disintegrate into dust. It even looked as though anarchic force dodged out of his way, forming a path for the sole purpose of allowing him to collide with Lionel. Shockwaves spread out in all directions. The wind rolled like waves and the clash caused the vicinity to tremble. They seemed evenly matched. However, bang! Conan suffered a foot to the chest, his body flying out like a meteor from the air and crashing into the ground below, digging out a trench that extended for dozens of meters. Chapter 1675. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:25 p.m. Chapter 1675. Stubborn. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel fell heavily from the ground. Although it sometimes looked as though the two were flying, the reality was that their leg strength was just so strong that they could clash as much in midair as they did on the ground. Landing with a bang, Lionel casually swept his spear out. He didn't even look like he had shed even a single bead of sweat, his clothing just as immaculate as it had been before and his cold smile in his eyes not fading in the slightest. If this is all you have, why did you bother to stand before me? Did you think that 20 years was really enough for the likes of you to catch up to me? Lionel's words caused the hearts of those in the surroundings to tremble. He was 8 tiers beneath Conan. He had lost 20 years of effort due to the time dilation. Conan had all the advantages on his side. And yet, none of it seemed to matter in the slightest. In the distance, Conan slowly rose to his feet. Despite the solid nature of Lionel's kick, he didn't seem injured in the slightest, and that was because he wasn't. Lionel's kick had done nothing more than humiliate him, and yet it stung more than even if a hole had been ripped through his chest. Standing to his full height, Conan's eyes locked onto Lionel, who was slowly walking toward him. All right. If that's what you want, let's do it. The sound of clanging armor resounded and golden force solidified all around Conan. Piece by piece, they connected to one another, forming a radiant armor that alternated between bestial furs and metal. Conan's arms flared outward as his gaze became even more dull. At that moment, the hairs on the back of Lionel's neck rose to attention. It didn't feel like he was being looked at by a human any longer. It was as though the Conan he knew had vanished, only to be replaced by an apex predator. Conan vanished, appearing before Lionel with a fist that could collapse mountains. The golden force around his knuckles took the shape of a roaring lion, the imprint shattering the ground it glided above as it appeared before Lionel's face. Lionel's eyes narrowed, raising his spear. Bang! Lionel's arms jolted before he dispersed the force behind the blow, and yet he was still forced to take 3 steps backward. Conan's leg rose into the air, lashing out like a whip. Lionel blocked once more, but Conan's next attack already appeared like a relentless avalanche. Fist, legs, elbows, knees, he flowed from one style to the next seamlessly. He didn't seem like he cared about what parts of his body he used, even once using his forehead to meet the tip of Lionel's spear without the slightest fluctuation in his eyes. Lionel found that predicting his next movement was almost impossible precisely because there was nothing to predict. This style, Lionel retreated again and again, his expression cold. The defense of his spear was airtight. His previous lack of skill was nowhere to be seen. He looked like a refined expert, even facing an enemy with a relentless, tireless assault. He didn't seem to be suffering too quickly. Lionel's spear spun in his hands. Swift. In that moment, the skies seemed to be filled with the shadows of Lionel's spear, his movements so fast that it was almost impossible to track with the naked eye. He seemed to embody more than just the world resonated, fusing with his movements to bolster his speed further, a melody that caused the heart to race, replaying in the ears of all those that laid eyes on him. Bang! 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 Lionel's movements became even faster, sometimes switching out swift for forceful, and sometimes forceful for subtle. The elegance of his spear technique touched upon a new level, one that made Valor and the other spearmen in the crowd watch on with heavy breaths. They could feel their spears trembling within their rings, wanting to make their ways out if for nothing other than to experience the beauty for themselves. 2 clashing shadows of gold danced around the Void Palace, each entering a state of absolute oneness with their martial arts. However, even with this being so, there was no doubt to those that could see what was happening clearly that Lionel was in a tier all to his own. Bang! 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 Lionel's spear pierced forward, his wrist flexing with such force that the tip of his golden spear trembled fiercely, causing one attack to suddenly become 3. Conan's fist had already flown forward and it was much too late for it to change trajectories, so instead, he fluidly flowed from a fist attack into an elbow strike, using the larger area of his forearm to block Lionel's maneuver. However, in response to that, Lionel flowed into a new stance as well, his pierce becoming a sweep upward that perfectly chained into the butt of his spear, colliding against Conan's liver. Conan's valiant armor trembled, a violent surge of force traveling through. An odd resonating feeling caused his entire body to tremble, his stoic expression giving way to a warped visage. He coughed out a mouthful of blood, half of his body trembling. Conan swiped out a claw at Lionel's head with one hand, using the other to protect his side from a second attack. However, Lionel had simply used the momentum of his first strike to spin his spear in the counter direction, swatting Conan's claw toward the sky and striking out with a palm toward his chest. Bang! Lionel's palm caused Conan to throw up another mouthful of blood as he flew backward. Once again he had lost. Conan roared into the skies, the fury and unwillingness in his tone clear for all to hear. At that moment, a wild surge of universal force descended from the skies, causing Lionel's eyes to narrow. Natural light realm. Lionel analyzed. He shook his head. How stubborn. Would he prefer to be beaten an inch within his life? Lionel fell to the ground, holding out his spear toward Conan as his aura rose. He exhaled, a white gold force surging around him. His hair became a spirit-like white, 3 enormous illusory tails spreading out to his back as his sideburns grew. Lionel took a step forward and vanished, his speed more than 10 times faster than before. Bang! Conan rebounded against the ground like a bouncing ball. Chapter 1676. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:24:58 p.m. Chapter 1676. Where to? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel was so fast that he pinged Conan around like a ping-pong ball, his speed crossing realms of reason. He appeared anywhere within his starry light domain he pleased in less than the blink of an eye. Every time he appeared in the path of Conan's trajectory, he would send another solid spear strike forward. If not for the robustness of Conan's armor and radiant force, he would have found himself full of holes. However, even though this hadn't happened, cracks began to appear all across his body. Conan found his head rattling around in his skull so much that he couldn't even gather up his universal force properly. Before Lionel's speed he was absolutely helpless. A hushed silence fell over the surroundings. This was a member of the Cataclysm generation, a man that they could only look up to, and yet he was being treated like a toy. Lionel didn't even seem to have been putting in that much effort. Every time Conan brought out more strength he would counter it with even more. It was clear to many that Lionel didn't want to give Conan the time to gather up universal force, but who cared? If you couldn't use your strength in battle, that was your fault. It wasn't the job of your enemy to allow you the time you would need. As for Lionel, he didn't fear Conan's natural light realm, he just felt that it would be too inconvenient to face right at this moment. Even if the natural light realm of this world couldn't compare to the zone, it was still considered to be a seventh-dimensional boost to one's strength here. It had to be remembered that universal force was what could help one to bridge the gap between dimensions, and this was especially true the higher in the dimensions you went. Lionel didn't want to expose the cards he would have to if Conan was allowed to bring out such an ability, so he simply reacted quicker than Conan could. Bang! Lionel landed heavily on the ground, his foot pressed firmly against Conan's chest. With a burst, the latter's valiant armor finally reached the end of its resistance, combusting into a rain of motes of light. Lionel looked down, pointing his spear to Conan's head with a single arm. His white hair faded back to its usual pale violet and his tails retracted. Leader. Release him. A surge of experts of the Lion's Pride faction tried to rush forward. They had wanted to interfere previously but they simply couldn't. The level of the battle had been too far beyond them. If they tried to rashly interfere they would have only made things worse. But now that things had reached this point, how could they continue to remain indifferent? The eyes of Simona and Armand flickered as they looked toward Lionel. They still found it hard to believe that what they were seeing was real. Armand, especially, had once thought less of Lionel because his lineage factor suppressed Lionel's own. Back then, Lionel wasn't ready for the phenomena, causing him to be shocked and taking a small loss in their exchange of gazes. But Armand was shocked by Lionel's performance in the Rapak's nest, and was further shocked by what he was seeing now. Although only Conan had spoken back then, they had all agreed with him. The large gap between them and Lionel came down to his Scarlet Star Force, a gap that they would be able to close in the future. In fact, the fact that Lionel started with this leg up would only harm him in the future due to the weakness of humans when it came to the manipulation of high-level forces. However, never did he think that Lionel would be able to defeat them with a 20-year disadvantage without using anything other than Spear Force. Even toward the end he didn't use Scarlet Star Force, but rather used Ethereal Star Force to boost his speed. He clearly hadn't gone all out at all. What these geniuses of the Cataclysm generation didn't know was that the Lionel they met was almost entirely ignorant of the ways of the dimensional verse. His spear technique was weak, his usage of his lineage factors was poor, his paths were unrefined and diverging. Ultimately, he couldn't match up to these geniuses who had been nurtured by their families since the moment they were born. However, now things had changed a great deal. He had learned far more about himself, and having taken a glimpse at what the true pinnacle was, he found these geniuses to be playing no more than a child's game. Conan? The mighty member of the Cataclysm generation? He wasn't even at the standard of a lower fiend-class demon without using universal force. Lionel raised his head, looking toward the charging youths. At that moment, a swirl of black appeared by Lionel's head, an adorable mink appearing with sparkling black eyes. Yip, yip. Little Black Star vanished. Bang, 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 bang. Numerous geniuses went flying one after another, unable to withstand even a single hit. They ended up in a more miserable state than even the one Lionel had put them in. Beneath his feet, Conan coughed, bits of flesh and blood coming out from his mouth. Lionel looked down indifferently. If this wasn't the Void Palace, you would be a single stroke away from death. You should learn to rein in your arrogance. Of course, do as I say, not as I do. Lionel laughed, removing his foot from Conan's chest, flipping his palm and allowing his spear to vanish. With a step, he appeared by Aina's side with a beaming smile as though he hadn't just been in a battle that shook the Void Palace. Little Black appeared on Lionel's shoulder, his long whiskers tickling against Lionel's cheek. Alright, this place is a bit boring, don't you think? Let's go elsewhere to kill some time. Aina raised an eyebrow. Where? Well, I originally wanted to go to the Senate to claim the missions they've been monopolizing, but there's really no point in doing that now that the Void Tower will cover it. I've been curious about the archery faction. I think that I'll swing by and give them a visit. Up above, Cornelius' lips twitched. The Void Elders were so wise, but it seemed they had made a mistake this time. Important announcement below. Chapter 1677. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:24 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1677. Two methods if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel did really want to enter the archery faction to see what they had to offer. Mostly he wanted to see what the highest echelon of bowmen in the human domain could do. Although it was a bit embarrassing now that he thought about it, Lionel's greatest reference for top-tier archery until now was from the genius of a family small even in comparison to the Luxniks. It was he who taught Lionel that bow force could be used cleverly to change the direction of an arrow mid-flight. Outside of this, Lionel had been on his own. This just went to show the sheer amount of talent Lionel had in the bow. Even seemingly without much effort, Lionel had been able to form enlightened bow force. In fact, now, after applying his grandfather's path of the spear to his bow as well, the current level of his bow force was on a level most couldn't fathom. At this point it was hard to tell if Ryu would gain anything from the archery faction, but he still wanted to see for himself. Still, there was a big hurdle he faced. He had been able to enter the spear faction for just a one-time payment. Apparently this had spread since he was still in debt. However, he obviously wouldn't be able to do the same thing with the archery faction. In the end, he had to do something that most would rather die than do: exchange void merits for void points. Although such an exchange existed, hardly anyone ever used it due to how difficult it was to gather void merits. However, Lionel couldn't be bothered to care very much, and though he was using Aina's void merits to accomplish it, she didn't seem to care very much either. Unlike others, the two felt that they had almost too many void merits. It would be hard to spend them all if they didn't use them like this. Once they had waded through the weird looks of the Senate branch overseer, they began to make the journey toward the archery faction. This region of the Void Palace wasn't one that Lionel had been in before. It made him realize just how much of this place he hadn't had the opportunity to see. Being the size of several planets put together, there was no doubting the vastness of the Void Palace. As Lionel and Aina moved at a leisurely pace, news of what happened just hours ago spread with the swiftness of the wind, but even so, it could only move about so quickly, especially after it was quickly monopolized by the information factions of the Void Palace. Once these powerful factions in the dark got their hands on such a thing, it was immediately placed at the top of their priority list and classified as top-shelf information. This state wouldn't last long, but they didn't need it to. They only needed to suppress it for a few days and rake in the profits. Once the time period passed, it would no longer be as valuable. This led to a weird situation where the information spread swiftly for the first few minutes, but was quickly stifled soon after. It seemed quite clear that the job of gathering information was only part of the duties of this information network. Just as important was the job of controlling the flow of information as well. Unless they could maximize their own benefits, what good was it to them if everyone else was well informed? As for their targets with this information, of course they only wanted the patronage of the most prominent figures of the Void Palace, as only they would be able to afford the exorbitant prices. The untouchable ranks of the sector-ranked disciples, the rest of the Cataclysm generation, the Morales family heirs, and, of course, the two lofty existences that seemed to stand alone within the Cataclysm generation: the sword deity Amory Suyard, the bow deity Nazag Terius. Lionel and Aina finally made it to the archery faction. As expected, this region was no less beautiful than the spear faction had been. In fact, the archery faction seemed to be even better than Lionel remembered the spear faction to be. There was a formation in the surroundings that staved off anarchic force. There was an artificial sun in the sky and radiant rainbow-colored clouds. The surroundings were exceptionally peaceful and even the air tasted sweet to breathe in. Lionel and Aina didn't gather much attention upon entering as there were many individuals going about their business. The price for just one day of entry was incredibly steep. Almost no one had the time to waste the precious hours on people watching, and those that could afford to do such a thing wouldn't be interested in two Tier 1 youths like Lionel and Aina. With a quick scan, Lionel saw many familiar buildings. There were training facilities, challenge facilities, resting rooms, and, what he was most interested in, technique centers. Lionel had been planning on just making a beeline for these technique centers, however his attention was caught by something else before he could. He came to a pause, causing Aina to look toward his side profile with a questioning glint in her eye. "So you can do that too?" Lionel's gaze locked onto a building in the distance. It was in the shape of a pagoda, and just looking at it from the outside, it was difficult to tell how many floors it had. At one glance, it looked like it had 7, but when Lionel blinked it became 8, then 9. It seemed to fluctuate from having as little as 3 floors to as many as 12 without rhyme or reason. Lionel had seen a building like this in the Spear faction as well, and he understood what it was. There were two methods of learning techniques in a weapon faction. The first was the conventional way. Go to the technique centers, find a description you liked, and exchange for it with money and points. The second method, however, didn't require the use of the money, but it was likewise far more troublesome to deal with. Lionel took Aina's hand and walked forward, an amused glint dancing in his eyes. Chapter 1678, published at 7th of March 2023, 3:24 and 54 seconds p.m. Chapter 1678, truly unmatched. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel appeared beneath the pagoda to find quite a group. In a space where no one wanted to waste even a single moment, it seemed to be completely the opposite in this region. Not only were they lingering, no one seemed to be in a rush to do anything. Seeing such a scene, Lionel had a feeling that he would see a repeat of what happened around the Void Tower again, but this time, it was even sadder than before. It could be said that the group around the Void Tower were mostly the lowest rung of the Void Tower. But anyone who could scrounge up the Void points and merits needed to enter this region was most definitely above average. And yet, here they were idly wasting their time. Lionel shook his head and stepped forward. You can wait here. I'm not sure how long it'll take, but it probably won't be too long. Aina smiled and nodded. She didn't mind waiting. Although she wasn't a bow woman, this was one weapon that she wasn't familiar with that she had some curiosity toward. Her instincts told her that it wasn't quite yet time to try out the bow, but there was no harm in taking a peek at something here. Many looked toward Lionel and Aina at this time, mostly because it was quite rare to see a woman like Aina. However, after Lionel began to walk forward, their reasons drastically changed. Stop. A commanding voice called out, but Lionel's attention was entirely focused on the pagoda ahead, a light smile on his face as he looked almost straight up. He was really curious about the illusion of this pagoda and what secrets were inside. His trigger finger was itching. I said stop. The voice of a woman boomed, but Lionel had already made it to the entrance. Due to the fact that no one had dared approach the pagoda, Lionel faced no obstruction to this point. But when the woman saw that Lionel truly had no intention of stopping, her palm shook to reveal a crystalline bow, a pinch of fury furrowing her brows. She pulled her bow string and released a streak aiming right for the back of Lionel's knee. Such an injury would leave him crippled for at least a few months without extraordinarily expensive treatment methods or rare healing lineage factors. However, just when the arrow was about to cripple Lionel's mobility, the bow force around it vanished when it entered a certain radius. Clang. The arrow hit against the back of Lionel's knee, rebounding into the hair without even the slightest result to show for it. Lionel's steps paused and he looked back, his gaze locking onto the woman who had pulled the bowstring. Considering they were all in a fairly confined area, the young woman was no more than 30 or so meters away from Lionel. At this distance, even Lionel himself would have trouble dodging the arrow of an expert archer in his base form. Of course, he could have dodged by calculating the trajectory of the arrow before she released it. By then, it would be a different matter entirely. However, he didn't do so as he didn't feel that there was a need to. The young woman was shocked. All archers had sharp eyes, it was one of the main prerequisites to reach their level. They all saw what happened almost too clearly, from the dispersal of the bow force to the fact that Lionel didn't even make a move to attempt to block. His innate defenses were more than enough to deal with the remaining momentum of the arrow. The young woman's heart couldn't help but beat wildly. Was that the Force Negation Ability Index? Usually, there weren't dividing ranks of ability indexes outside of the tiers within them. By and large, two abilities at Tier 3 would both have about the same amount of usefulness. However, there were still some ability indexes that were far more sought after than others. While many might abandon their ability indexes in favor of their legacy factors or other innate abilities, there were some ability indexes which would be honed no matter how high your birth was. Force Negation was definitely one of these abilities. Fighting such a person made it feel like you were doing so with one hand tied behind your back. Still, after her initial shock, the young woman's expression became dark. The Bao Pagoda is not an option to outsiders right now. The Bao deity party is currently inside, wait until they are finished. Lionel looked the young woman up and down before turning around and entering the so-called Bao Pagoda. His actions left everyone absolutely stunned. Did he not know what the Bao deity party was and what power they held? Wait, it's actually him. The heart of the young man by the young woman pulsated. The young woman frowned, looking over toward him. You know him? She asked. No, I don't know him, but I saw him in the Void Senate just yesterday. He was the one who heavily injured Triana and Joey before somehow escaping punishment from Majority Leader Sweared. The young woman, a member of the Terrius family who went by Lyra, felt her heart skip a beat when she heard this. Triana? Joey? Regardless of which of them it was, both were strong enough to crush her with a single finger, but he had heavily injured them both? News of what had happened in the Void Senate also flowed out in a very slow and controlled fashion, but the members of the Bao Deity Party were hyper-aware of what had happened since it involved a member of their own faction. Now this person had actually come to their archery faction so boldly and openly? A flash of rage flashed within the young woman's eyes. Report this. We need to report this now. Aina was easily able to hear all of these conversations, inwardly shaking her head. Lionel was truly very good at getting into trouble. In this aspect he was truly unmatched. Chapter 1679. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:24 and 54 seconds p.m. Chapter 1679. Bao Pagoda. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's vision spun. When it cleared once again he felt as though he was standing in the depths of space. There was a sea of vast stars as far as his eyes could see, and beneath his feet, there was nothing but a small black platform. However, Lionel wasn't alone. By his side, there were 3 others, all 3 of whom were young men and surprised to see him. Soon though their surprise turned into a frown. They didn't recognize Lionel, so they also couldn't understand how this person could possibly be bold enough to ignore the restrictions of the Bao Deity Party. They hadn't even bothered to leave anyone stationed outside because this had already become the norm for long enough. Who are you? One of them asked this with a deep frown. It was impossible to directly attack anyone while in the Bao Pagoda, so words was all they could use until the event began. Lionel swept gaze over these people and smiled. Lionel Morales. The brows of the 3 young men jumped. Morales? That was a last name anyone who was anyone in the human domain would know. However, soon they calmed. The Morales family had many members in the Void Palace. The number was great. After all, it wasn't just the 7 Novas who carried the Morales name here. Not all Morales could instill fear in others like the 7 Novas could, or rather, the 6 Novas, as very few knew of Lionel. That said, most Morales were under the protection of one of the 6 Novas, so the 3 of them didn't dare to be too hostile with Lionel. Even so, that didn't mean that they would be welcoming. Morales? A spearman wants to dip his toes into something that has little to do with him? The young man who went by Craze snorted. He knew that it was already too late to kick Lionel out, so he was unhappy. Don't be upset, Craze. The Bao Pagoda is usually worth a few days of torture, at least like this we'll have some entertainment. The 3 young men laughed, but Lionel's smile didn't fade. With a stretch and yawn, Lionel loosened up his limbs before waving at the air and forming a bow out of emulation spatial force. Seeing this, the eyes of 3 flickered, but they still shook their heads in the end as they pulled out their own bows. Although the force Lionel had just used was one they had never personally seen before, what good was it if his skill wasn't good? Keep talking about entertainment, Kaisen, and it'll crush you even worse than last time. The 3rd boy, Malol, sneered. You 2 talk too much for 2nd and 3rd place. You get 1 first place and suddenly you're talking so big, Craze sneered back. 1. Malol laughed, holding his bow up. Your face is pretty thick. If my calculations are correct, this will be my 14th first place in a row. The faces of Craze and Kaisen darkened as they brandished their own bows. Lionel suddenly chuckled, causing the 3 to look over. But by this point he had already stopped paying attention to them. At that moment the surrounding space began to warp. As though they had entered hyperdrive, the stars whipped by at blazing speeds. Twang, twang. Lionel lightly tested his bowstring, not paying attention to the changes. The Bao Pagoda didn't have a fixed challenge much like the Void Tower. However, in comparison to the Void Tower, it was even more complex because it was prepared to provide a test to just one person or multiple people at once. That said, it was consensus that there were more variations to be had when the pagoda tested more people at once, and as such, the rewards were potentially more lucrative as a result. Whether or not this was actually true was unknown, but due to the sheer length of time the trial lasted, it was more fun to enter with others than to not to, so it was potentially an excuse others came up with to avoid the loneliness of training alone. The speeding stars came to a halt and the skies trembled. When their vision adjusted, they found themselves standing upon what looked like highway lanes formed by starlight. They stood about 50 meters apart and targets in the distance moved from left to right. The closest target was 500 meters away. The second was 1 kilometer away. The third, fourth and so on continued in 1 kilometer increments until 10 kilometers was reached, whereupon the next was 20 kilometers away. The speed of the targets were consistent and not very fast, moving at maybe 5 kilometers an arrow. All things considered, this wasn't a very elaborate test, it hardly needed to be explained. Whoever pierced through the furthest target would win. As for the more complex rules, there were some. First, one had to start with the closer targets before progressing. You would only have 3 chances to miss before you would drop out of the race. Finally, you could skip targets, however should you miss, the 3 chances would vanish all at once and you would be eliminated. The 3 young men, Malale, Craze and Kaisen, all aimed at once, their arrows whizzing through the air and shattering the 500 meters target all at once. They reset themselves in the blink of an eye, pulling their bowstrings once again and shattering the kilometer target. At close distances they could simply brute force it. Their arrows flew so fast that the movement of the target was almost irrelevant. The faster they were, the easier this trial would be. By the time they prepared to shoot down their 3rd target, Lionel had yet to prepare to shoot at his first. The difference seemed obvious to them. However, Lionel was actually just paying attention to their movements. After all, he had come here to learn first and foremost. But seeing their brute force method, he quickly became bored. He raised his bow, his back tightening and his chest expanding. Twang! Lionel's arrow shot over the 500-meter target, high and far to the right, causing the 3 to be shocked for a moment before their laughter rang out. Unfortunately for them, the shattering of a target much further ahead jarred them awake. Their heads turned, their pupils constricting as the 5-kilometer target shattered into motes of light. Lionel pulled his bowstring again, releasing a moment later. Bang! The 10-kilometer target shattered. Chapter 1680? Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:24 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1680. Be obedient. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze was frighteningly sharp, a suffocating coldness rolling off of his body in waves. After he crossed the 10-kilometer mark, the difficulty shot up with every increment coming in sets of 10 kilometers. The truth was that when one was on a planet, assuming a flat surface, 10 kilometers was already far enough for a target to disappear over the curvature of a normally sized planet. As such, even if you could aim further, it was useless unless you had methods to stand in the air. Obviously, this trial wasn't set on a planet's surface, and neither did the Void Palace have the curvature of a planet either. However, even so, the Void Palace had other limitations such as anarchic force that didn't allow targeting from so far away. This was all to say that even the expert archers of the Void Palace didn't have practice aiming at targets that were so far away, even if it was a still target, let alone a target that was moving at 5 kilometers an hour. Seeing Lionel skip right to 5 kilometers, and then immediately to 10 kilometers, left Malal, Kraz and Kaisen absolutely tongue-tied. Usually in this trial, making it to the 5-kilometer mark was already an excellent result, but he actually directly skipped over it. And it didn't even look like he was finished. Lionel adjusted the arc of his bow, moving from a straight line and raising it into the air. With a twang, he released another arrow, allowing it to beautifully arc through the air. Bang! The 20-kilometer target shattered. Lionel's gaze blazed. At that moment, the bowstring of his bow construct became thicker as he pulled it back once again and raised his bow even higher. A gorgeous arc flew through the air once again, shattering the 30-kilometer target. Without fail, Lionel's arrow passed through the center of the target. At such a distance, the 3 archers by his side couldn't even see the targets clearly, but the sound was undeniable and the motes of light were blinding. Lionel strengthened his bowstring again, his forearm and back rippling as he pulled back and struck again and then again. The 50-kilometer target shattered. Lionel's eyes narrowed. There was number 60-kilometer target. Up ahead, an extra 50 kilometers further, a 100-kilometer target lay. Even with Lionel's vision amplified by his starry-tailed fox lineage factor, he still couldn't see it clearly. At that moment, Lionel's irises glowed with a blinding white-gold light. He could use his internal sight to cover the distance, but he didn't feel that it was necessary. His pupils dilated, a hint of a bestial aura rippling off of his body in a concentrated steam. His vision was instantly magnified, the blurry target in the distance suddenly felt as though it was right in front of him. Lionel squeezed his bow construct, crushing it into motes of light. With a flip of his palm, a shimmering bow appeared in his hands, causing the eyes of the 3 youths to open wide. White Lion Bow. It's you. Lionel didn't seem to hear them at all, his expression calm as he drew, inhaled, released, and exhaled. His movements were smooth and seemed to fuse into nature itself, the painting of a beautiful scenery causing the thoughts of the 3 young men to come to a grinding halt, albeit for just a moment. Bang! In the distance, a radiant pillar of light shot into the skies, causing the trials to ripple wildly in all directions. Lionel lowered his bow and cast a glance at it for a moment. He hadn't used the white lion bow in a very long time, but it felt heavier now than it had in the past, which was odd. The bow should have gotten much lighter, not heavier. Interesting. You don't like the path I've taken? Lionel chuckled. How stubborn. The white lion bow had acknowledged him the moment he touched it all those years ago, and now it seemed to be dissatisfied. But since it wasn't a true life-grade bow and was only quasi-life grade, it couldn't make any sweeping changes after already accepting him once. If it was truly a life-grade weapon, its dissatisfaction would probably mean that Lionel wouldn't be able to use it at all. Lionel found the phenomenon to be interesting. After all, compared to his past self, his skill was on a completely different level. Although he didn't form 7th-dimensional bow force, he could whenever he wanted. The only reason he didn't was because he felt that his bow force had far more potential to unleash at its current stage. To think the white lion bow wouldn't be happy with him. Lionel chuckled. Are you mad that I used a system designed for the spear with you? Is the same difference, don't you think? Is there a need for this tantrum? The bow vibrated, seemingly understanding what Lionel was saying. Be obedient, Lionel said lightly, his smile fading. This is just the beginning regardless. If you can't keep up, it'll leave you behind. By then, you won't have the luxury of showing your dissatisfaction at all. The bow vibrated again, clearly unhappy. But in the end, it still obediently became lighter in the end. With a flip of his palm, the white lion bow vanished. This wasn't the first time Lionel had felt the dissatisfaction of his weapon forces. Back then, when he first formed enlightened bow force, his spear domain lineage factor had tried to stop it from happening before it failed. However, with the two clashing like this, it was inevitable the head-butting would end in them being weaker than they could be. If one reason Lionel hadn't truly stepped onto sovereignty with either one was because of the oddity of his king's might lineage factor, then another reason was this. However, Lionel had no intention of giving up either one. So if they couldn't learn to be obedient the nice way, he would force them. At that moment, the pillar of light in the distance descended before Lionel, forming the image of a complex network of force arts. Chapter 1681. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:24 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1681. Curiosity. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Hearing Lionel speak to the white lion bow in such a way, an undisguised fury lit in the eyes of the three young men. Discarding the white lion bow? Forcing it to be obedient? What kind of ridiculously arrogant words were these? No, it was even worse than that. It was blasphemy of the highest order, and it only seemed to confirm the speculation about the dubious methods by which Lionel gained control over the white lion bow. Unfortunately for them, Lionel was still not listening to them, his mind entirely focused on the force art before him. At that moment, the force art surged forward, fusing with Lionel's eyes before he could properly react to what was going on. A rush of information flooded Lionel's mind, but more importantly, he felt a rush of energy flood into his eyes, winding in a feedback loop between them and his brain again and again. Every time the energy revolved, Lionel felt that his vision became clearer. In just a few seconds, his vision was as strong as when he used the starry-tailed fox's eyes despite the fact he hadn't activated it. Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow. Was this a reward of the Bao Pagoda? Wasn't it supposed to give out techniques? But just as Lionel thought this, the rush of information in his mind consolidated and formed a nameless technique. It worked by forming a force art in the irises with the use of Bao force. This force art would thus gather all the force in the surroundings and funnel it toward your eyes, making it possible to see further. Lionel raised an eyebrow. All things considered, to most people this technique was hyper-useful. In fact, even to him it could be considered so. Although his internal sight would probably still be more useful, this technique had its own applications. However, all things considered, he wasn't too overly excited about it, it was just alright. Still, while his own reaction was benign, the reaction of the three youths was vastly different from just this. In fact, they felt like their worlds were being flipped upside down. Lionel might be ignorant about what was happening here, but how could they be? All of the pagodas of the Void Palace had a single line connecting them, the domain ring heirlooms. There was one pagoda in the archery faction, one in the spear faction and one in the sword faction. These were the three pagodas. At least they were the three that remained. It was said that many years ago, before even the establishment of the Void Palace, the ultimate reward of these pagodas were, precisely, the domain rings. Thanks to these pagodas, the spear domain, sword domain and Bao domain rings were all claimed by the human race. Unfortunately, also during an event many years ago, the Terius family lost their Bao domain ring, severing the inheritance of the pagoda. This meant that while one could climb the pagodas and receive its rewards, its ultimate reward would forever elude you. This was the harsh reality. Without the Bao Domain ring, it was simply impossible to gather the full inheritance. However, even with this being the case, the pieces of the inheritance were still greatly sought after. Only one person could ultimately have the Bao Domain ring after all. So for everyone else, cobbling together these pieces of the inheritance was the greatest boon that they could hope for. The troublesome part was that gaining these pieces was far too difficult to the point that it was impossible for those that didn't awaken the Bao Domain lineage factor. But due to the loss of the Bao Domain ring, the number of individuals who awakened this lineage factor in each subsequent generation was continuously lessening. And yet, today, someone who had the Spear Domain lineage factor had actually succeeded? How was that possible? The worst part was that Lionel didn't even seem to be showing any happiness at all. He looked completely unimpressed. If it wasn't for the fact they couldn't attack him personally, they would have stormed forward to strangle him to death with their own hands. Before they could say anything further, Lionel's platform surged forward, vanishing into the second floor. The three grit their teeth, turning their attention toward their own trials. They had to hurry up and catch up. If they didn't, who would stop him? A helpless light flashed in their irises. Even if they caught up, how would they stop him exactly? This felt like all those years ago when that woman charged into the archery faction and took the White Lion Bao away under everyone's eyes. There were rules they all had to follow. Gatekeeping things like this was impossible. Even if the Morales family and the Suyard family allowed their pagodas to stay here, so what could they say if Lionel gained all the pieces of the inheritance? If they complained, wouldn't people say that they only left the pagodas here as long as no one actually used them for their intended purpose? By then, what would be the point in leaving these pagodas here at all? Lionel couldn't be bothered with the thoughts of the three as he was entirely focused on the trials. Although he was uninterested in what was the first reward, he wanted to see if there was anything better waiting for him ahead. To do this, he realized that he would have to reach the highest standards for each of these tests, but he wasn't very worried about doing this. Compared to all of his other abilities, what he was maybe the most confident in was his throwing ability. There was a second, it was his archery. If there was a standard to be reached here, he would definitely reach it. It was that simple to him. He completed the second trial even faster than he had in the first, watching as the second pillar of light descended before him with a hint of curiosity. Chapter 1682. Published at 7th of March 2023 3:24 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1682. 6th. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The force art actually rushed toward Lionel's eyes again. He could feel as the force ran from his eyes to his brain and back again. The process was the exact same as last time, but the results were different. The first time, Lionel felt that his vision became far sharper than it had in the past, and this time, this was somewhat what happened as well. But this wasn't all that happened. It felt as though he could suddenly see on a different wavelength. Not only could he see the visual light spectrum, but he could now also see in the infrared light spectrum. This was a step more useful to Lionel than just sharper vision would be, and there were even applications of it that would be far more useful than just internal sight would be. Still, it wasn't enough to be groundbreaking. However, the step up from the last reward made Lionel perk up. He really wanted to see just how far this would go. When he passed the third trial, he gained not just infrared vision but something similar to X-ray vision. From what Lionel understood about light waves, X-ray vision, at least taken in the most literal sense, wouldn't work properly. X-ray waves were too rare in the world to be used like other waves of light could. This would mean that someone with X-ray vision would have to be both an X-ray wave emitter and receptor. Even if a higher dimensional individual wouldn't have to worry about the side effect of cancer, acting as both an emitter and receptor would make the ability useless. In practice, this would mean that Lionel would have to emit waves first and then rush to the other side of his enemy to see what came out of the other side. Even though he could theoretically do this if he relied on his starry light domain, it was simply too ridiculous to use in battle, especially since the best application of this vision would be to spot things he didn't know were there in the first place. How would he run to the other side of something he wasn't aware of the existence of? This was why Lionel was sure this so-called X-ray vision worked based on different principles. If he was correct, it likely relied on detecting and using higher forms of light force. Regardless of what principles it worked on, it was yet another step up. All three of the abilities worked together well, but what somewhat irked Lionel was that they didn't seem to be willing to fuse into a true whole. He felt that if this happened, there would be a qualitative change. Unfortunately, what Lionel was hoping for wouldn't happen precisely because of the fact the Bao domain ring no longer existed in the human domain. Without it, How could these abilities fuse into the true Bao domain lineage factor? Still, Lionel continued. Although he couldn't fuse these techniques, he could still somewhat force them to work in tandem using his control over his body. Together, they were far more useful to Lionel, and it was enough to bring a smile to his face. When Lionel stepped into the fourth trial, he found that the difficulty increased somewhat and the frame of time he could use his Bao construct for was drastically lowered, but he still managed to achieve the highest honors with relative ease. When he received the reward, Lionel found that the world around him changed. Just looking around, he could see force flowing through the air. It felt quite surreal. Usually, force could only be seen in high concentrations. This was because neutral force, the most ubiquitous kind of force, and it was colorless and transparent. It was only when someone with an affinity called forward a particular kind of force and increased its concentration, or more often, expelled it from their bodies, would force be visible to the naked eye. But right now, Lionel was certain that this was what he was seeing. He didn't see it in color, but it was almost as though he could feel it. It was difficult to explain. The neutral force was still colorless, and yet Lionel still felt like he could see it. Lionel rushed forward to the fifth trial, finally feeling somewhat agitated. When he passed it, his sense of neutral force became fiercer. When he looked down at his arm, he could see the flow of force flowing through him. It was like his X-ray vision had suddenly progressed to the point where he could observe the flow of force within the bodies of others. Lionel's heart skipped a bit. If the first trial's rewards were easily shrugged off by him, this was an absolute game-changer. If this ability was paired with his ability index, his predictive abilities would reach a completely different level. So long as he saw an individual circulate a technique once, he would know exactly when they would use it again. In fact, just with a glance, so long as someone used a technique that he was familiar with, he would be able to copy it. Others who might have gained this ability would have no chance at doing this. The network of nodal pathways and nodes and bodies of everyone was different. It was a complex net that was impossible to tease apart at a glance, and it only became more complex as one rose through the tiers. However, with his mind, would this be a problem for Lionel? Lionel rushed into the sixth trial and finally began feeling some pressure. Targets rotated all around him with no sense of reason or thought. It was the picture of chaos. Even after several minutes, Lionel couldn't find any patterns. Without a choice, Lionel could only use a brute force method, shooting his arrows so fast that the erratic movements of the targets didn't have a chance to dodge out of his way. For the first time, Lionel didn't manage to hit the targets exactly in their center, but he had adjusted for enough error that it didn't matter. A slight sweat fell from Lionel's brows as he faced the pillar of light once again. An even more complex force art took shape. Chapter 1683, published at 7th of March 2023, 3:30 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1683. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1683. Predict previous chapter. The force art surged into Lionel's eyes once again, a familiar loop quickly taking form. By this point, the similarities to the spear domain lineage factor were all too obvious. But the difference here was that while the changes to his brain for the spear were related to his body, reflexes and muscles for the Bao, they were entirely reliant on his eyes. When Lionel looked around this time, however, he couldn't help but be shocked. It suddenly felt as though a two-dimensional world had become three-dimensional. It was such a shocking change that Lionel had to close his eyes, only to open them up again slowly and see an even more exaggerated result. It was obvious that the world was three-dimensional. This was something that everyone accepted from the time they were young. However, just because the world was three-dimensional didn't mean that the eyes saw it this way. What was three-dimensional to the eye of an individual was just a feedback loop of lighting and shadows, when in reality, all one could ultimately see was a single flat surface. It couldn't be helped, vision was simply always limited in this way. A person could only face a single direction at a time, and even if you had the full scan of an object in your memories, you couldn't stitch them together to form a new and more substantial representation. However, these eyes were different. Lionel could tell that it was no longer a trick of his mind convincing him that the world was three-dimensional. For the first time, he truly felt that the world had depth, not just due to shadows and lighting, but in a more substantial reality. When Lionel looked at his hand, it was as though the photons that bounced around it curved in a way that he could see the front, back and sides of it all at once. His mind would then process this image like a three-dimensional graphic designing software and create a perfect replica that would then become the image he saw in his mind. It wasn't just his hand that was like this either. Whether it was the platform he stood on, the Bao in his hand, or the targets in the distance, all of them were like rendered images in Lionel's brain. It was a fascinating overload of information. It felt like his eyes were taking snapshots at every conceivable angle and then stitching them all together into a single global image. It was like his eyes had become internal sight. Lionel knew that this was an ability that internal sight had long ago, but somehow, this felt so much different. In reality, if things were taken at face value, internal sight was even better. This was because while internal sight was called as such, it could translate the other senses to the mind of the user as well. Whether it was smell or touch or hearing, Lionel could use them all through his internal sight. However, these eyes only worked with sight and sight alone. That said, not all sight was created equal. This was proven just by the fact that Lionel's starry spirit domain was so much more powerful than his internal sight despite having a smaller range. Some things could just see better than others. And these eyes were definitely beyond his internal sight and pure sight alone. However, it was beneath his starry spirit domain in the same respect. Even so, Lionel wasn't disappointed by this for two reasons. Firstly, with the advancement in his sight, these eyes could see further than his starry spirit domain could. In addition, the stamina drain that it had was far lesser as well. It took a lot out of Lionel to use the full scale of his starry spirit domain, which was why he often only used a small portion of it. But these eyes seemed to work almost no differently from his own eyes. The only pain of these eyes was that they didn't stack well with the previous abilities he had gained. If he wanted to use them one at a time, there was no issue. But if he wanted to forcefully use them together, then the stamina consumption would increase. Lionel was even more certain that these abilities were meant to be fused into one. In fact, he was sure that if they did fuse, the stamina consumption might even be less than it currently was when he used just a single ability. That aside, the second reason he wasn't disappointed was because he had a feeling that this was just the beginning. The next ability, the seventh, would be a qualitative change. That he was absolutely certain of. When Lionel entered the seventh trial, however, he could only frown. He stood in silence for a long time before closing his eyes and taking deep breaths. This trial was even more complicated than the last. In the previous trial, the targets were erratic and impossible to predict the movement of. They didn't have the mannerisms of humans, so Lionel couldn't use his predictive abilities to guess where they would go, and because they had no mass, there was no inertia or momentum for them to care about. With these factors compounded, Lionel could only use a brute force method, tiring himself out by putting his 100% into every single release of his bowstring. One could imagine how difficult the trial had been if Lionel, even with his current strength, was tired out in doing so. But this trial here, if the last one was difficult, was absolutely impossible. Not only did it have the exact same structure, but it added a layer of complexity, changing colors. Lionel's task was to take out the red orbs. If he accidentally hit the green ones, he would lose one of his 3 lives. If he accidentally hit a blue orb, he would lose immediately. The difficulty here was that the color of the orbs was not fixed. They could randomly change their colors at any time seemingly without rhyme or reason. It was even more difficult to predict than their flight paths. Chapter 1684. Published at 7th of March 2023, 3:30 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1684. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1684 Flow. Previous chapter. Lionel really didn't know what to do about this. If he ignored his already drained stamina and tried to brute force it once again, he would have to rely entirely on luck, and not just any normal amount of luck, but an obscene amount. If there was a 50-50 chance, Lionel might be willing to try it even though it would be a bit foolish. But after just a glance, even though he couldn't calculate the exact number, he knew the odds were lower than 1 in 1,000. In fact, just saying 1 in 1,000 was probably underestimating the difficulty of this trial far too much. Until this point, the trials hadn't been too complex, but they would slowly add wrinkles step by step to make it more difficult. Up until now, the first few wrinkles had already been putting pressure on him, but his skill as a bowman had allowed him to make it through. By the time he got to the 6th trial, however, his skill alone already wasn't enough, and he wasn't even certain of how many trials there were left. From Lionel's calculations, he would have to be at least tier 4 to brute force this trial, and there was also no guarantee that these trials didn't increase in difficulty with his own prowess. In fact, he had a feeling that the only reason he could brute force a complicated trial like the 6th at all was because he was so much more powerful in comparison to his peers of the same level. But now it was impossible. The only chance then was to find a different method. These trials wouldn't be designed with a chance at victory. This meant that there was a certain skill necessary to reach this point. In truth, if Lionel wanted just the normal rewards associated with these trials, he wouldn't be so tired right now. But there was only one goal he had in mind at this point: gain the greatest reward available. Lionel's eyes suddenly snapped open. That's it. Lionel exhaled, the simulation his mind had been going through coming to an end. The best predictor of future success was past success. After several moments of having no breakthroughs and finding a path out of this trial, Lionel instead decided to replay the other trials in his mind with a specific focus on the sixth. What he found made his eyes light up. When he looked at things in the sixth trial through normal eyes, there really was no pattern of flight. However, when Lionel filtered it through the reward of the sixth trial, everything changed. In a two-dimensional perspective, there really was nothing to be seen. But from a three-dimensional perspective, everything changed. The flight paths were very cleverly designed to hide this from Lionel, especially since his internal sight was sealed away after the third trial was completed. When Lionel realized this, he replayed the fifth trials and backward in his head, applying the new abilities he gained from them, and he realized the truth. It seemed that the easiest method to make it through these trials was to somehow gain an inkling into what the ultimate reward for the trial would be. Only in that way could you find a path out. But this was easier said than done even for Lionel. Still, he had one method in his back pocket. He would use all of the rewards he had gotten until now at once. Lionel's gaze flashed. Deep within their pale violet hues, a glass-like force took shape, making one feel as though they were looking into a mirror when they faced him. Lionel layered all of the rewards on top of one another. Sharpened vision, infrared vision, X-ray vision, force flow vision, three-dimensional vision. Lionel's gaze watched it all, layering the feedback atop of one another and forcing himself to take in every detail. Others might find themselves overloaded quickly, but this was what Lionel felt he was best at. His pupils danced back and forth, taking in every target one after another, looking for something, anything. He observed the targets from all angles, from above, from below, from the sides. Red veins pulsed within the whites of his eyes, and his focus was unprecedented and unmatched. He didn't seem to notice the throbbing at all. Slowly, the movements of the circular orbs of lights and their flickering colors became rainbow-colored lines in Lionel's vision. He layered their paths on top of one another, building a maze of networks in his head that became more and more complicated with every passing moment. And then it all seemed to slow. Something in Lionel's mind seemed to snap, and he raised his bow. His movements were quick and sharp, but also fast and steady. Every time he realized another arrow, it was as though he was simply releasing a breath, his chest moving up and down in a steady rhythm. Bang, 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 bang. On the outside, a shocking change was taking place. The pagoda that always seemed to fluctuate between 3 and 12 floors had been frozen. The three youths, Malal, Kraz and Kaisen, had all been kicked out after the fourth trial, but currently the pagoda was showing 7. Previously, he had steadily risen from 4 to its current stage now, leaving the archery faction in silence, because they all knew exactly what this meant. Those of the Bao deity party looked on with ugly expressions. They had already heard the news from the three youths who had exited, so they knew exactly who was inside, but they could do nothing about it. However, when the pagoda switched from 7 floors to 8, a tsunami rushed through the archery faction. Lionel exhaled a breath, his gaze sharp. Slowly, the changes due to absorbing the force art made themselves known. At first he was still calm, but after a while, even his eyes could only widen. For a very long while, even with his intelligence, he couldn't quite explain just what he was seeing. And in the end, he felt that only one word was appropriate: flow. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.